Chapter 4, McVeigh's Imperceptibly Binding Chains. Part 1, The Tale of the Dastardly Doppelgangers and the Manchurian Terrorist. If the world is where we hide from ourselves, what do we do when the world is no longer accessible? We invent a false name, invent a destiny, purchase a firearm through the mail. CIA agent and black operator, Whit Everett, from Don DeLillo's Libra, 1988. The apparatus is precisely what we can't see or name. We can't measure it, gentlemen, or take its photograph. It is the mystery we can't get hold of, the plot we can't uncover. This doesn't mean there are no plotters. Paranoid radio talk show host, Weirdbeard, DeLillo, Libra, 1988. What follows is an amalgamation of conflicting narratives, whose internal contradictions, points of intersection and digression, once identified, confound any particular version, reveal critical gaps in and between them, clear a path for new interpretive possibilities, and demonstrate the historical quandary left in McVeigh's wake. On the other hand, while not attempting to argue any one particular theory of the case, by pitting all the narratives about McVeigh and the bombing against each other and highlighting certain aspects of each, I do hope to undermine any version that insultingly argues that the reality of either can be understood by a few simple truths. Leaving Buffalo, late 1992 to early 1993. While in the Army, Timothy McVeigh, the model soldier, visited military doctors and dentists at a startling rate. Shortly before he quit the Army, he confided to his supply sergeant, James Rockwell, his belief that he had a computer chip in his backside, that the military had done things to him he was unhappy about, and added, "I think they've brainwashed me or injected me with something." Upon returning home, he made regular visits to the Buffalo VA, where, according to statements made to the FBI, military doctors treated him for paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that caused him to black out for long periods of time and left him with a secret life he could not remember. At this time, he expressed his growing concern about the availability of healthcare, medical abuse conspiracies, and the privacy of his personal medical records, the existence or location of which remains undetermined. In his final letter to Steve Hodge before quitting his job and setting off on the road in late 1992, McVeigh said he was leaving for an undisclosed location, and that this might be their last communication for some time. He told Steve to read 1984 in Brave New World, warning that Big Brother is capable of more than just jamming ham radio frequencies, they will lock you up. He lamented about the long line of dissidents before him that had been diagnosed as mentally ill, and even involuntarily hospitalized for failing to fit in with the norm. Someday, McVeigh said, he too might be locked up and labeled schizophrenic or a white racist. He explained that schizophrenia and other mental illnesses are only social constructs, sane responses to an insane world, and he was simply a radical political thinker and extremist in every sense of the word. He then issued similar warnings to others, including his former CalSpan co-worker Carl LeBron, to whom he claimed someday people would come looking for him, McVeigh, perhaps even people from CalSpan. LeBron said McVeigh was cagey about where he was going, but did mention he had taken a civilian job painting military vehicles. He told a handful of other individuals that he was leaving town to work in an unspecified but military-related capacity. His attorneys noted he needed to make a list of all the people he had said this to. Unknown to them, during this same time, McVeigh told Terry Nichols that while in the Army he had been recruited to carry out undercover missions. According to David Paul Hammer, McVeigh said that in late 1992, while still in Buffalo, he received a call from his handler, the Major, who told McVeigh to get his affairs in order and be ready to enter the field for several months. McVeigh was then drilled extensively for days about his knowledge of well-known and obscure figures in the extreme right-wing anti-government movement, their rhetoric, and his ability to use it convincingly. After proving his skills, McVeigh was instructed to travel the gun show circuit and immerse, inform on, and assess the actions of those in the right-wing anti-government movement. While he would have only minimal contact with his handlers during this time, McVeigh was to report his progress by leaving voicemails at a secured telephone number given to him by the Major. McVeigh's old Army buddy, Terry Nichols, would ultimately be tried in a federal and state court for his participation in the bombing. After the conclusion of his state trial, when he could no longer be tried again, Nichols, who had never spoke publicly about his knowledge of the bombing, began to tell his story. He said that during a visit with McVeigh in December 1992, McVeigh told him that, while in the Army, he had been recruited to carry out undercover missions. He did not say who recruited him or specify the nature of his mission. McVeigh did say, however, that he was to begin making contacts with a network of people after the first of the year, and that he was to take no action in furtherance of this mission until called upon, and would soon be making his first contact down south. Although the existence of the FBI's PatCon operation remained unknown for another 15 years, until 2007, in August 1992, on the heels of Ruby Ridge, the focus of PatCon's ostensive fact-finding mission was reauthorized and expanded. Rather than seeking incriminating information about any one particular individual for the purposes of criminal prosecution, operatives were now to gather information concerning a nationwide alliance of white supremacist groups being formed to fight the U.S. government. Whether internal or external, actual or imaginary, his decision to leave was based on overwhelming and powerful forces, so much so that it almost seemed he had no choice in the matter. His friend and former co-worker at Burns, Andrea Augustine, said the last time she saw him, she could tell he wanted to stay, and he almost did. But then he kept saying, "You don't understand, I really have to go." He just kept saying it. From the time he left New York in January 1993 until the summer of 1993, McVeigh's activities are difficult to trace due to a lack of documentation in some instances and an overwhelming but conflicting amount in others. Stickney described this period as the Lost Days. While largely untraceable, McVeigh's life turned into what could only be called the Lost Crusade, but it was during this odyssey of uncertainty that he became seriously involved in a dangerous world. Whether of his own volition or under instructions, McVeigh now began his long, arduous descent into the paramilitary underworld of conspiracy theorists, anti-Semites, racists, militias, tax protesters, Second Amendment advocates, and others, who mobilized in the shadow of the looming Brady Bill. At this point, wrote Stickney, McVeigh believed Big Brother was now watching him, the government had become the enemy and was now keeping tabs on him, and he believed a black car was following him when he went out driving. McVeigh began leading a double life and took measures to ensure that it remained well hidden. He stayed on the move, traveling the country, rented a number of mailboxes in various states under a number of assumed names, took to using several aliases, and began to use a calling card in the name of Darrell Bridges to communicate. Later, Michael Fortier's mother, Irene, would tell CNN that Timothy McVeigh had lived two lives and the truth was going to come out. Various people later reported that from this time until the day of the bombing, they had known the man they saw in the televised perp walk not as Timothy McVeigh, but as alternately Chuck, Darrell Bridges, Steve Murphy, Robert Kling, born April 19, 1972, Mike Havens, Mike Foley, Sergeant Mack, Sean Rivers, Joe Rivers, David Gilmore, Richard Menton, Tim Tuttle, Tom Tuttle, Terry Tuttle, Jerry Tuttle, Tom Sneed, Tim McEgee, Tim McNay, Tim McVeigh, Tim Johnson, and Timmy, among other names. He kept multiple driver's licenses and alternate license plates. Phone records indicate that during this time, somebody used his Darrell Bridges calling card to place 685 calls to individuals and businesses throughout the country. Shortly after leaving Western New York, McVeigh sent his sister an article about 51-year-old retired Sergeant Major Lawrence Friedman, a former Green Beret, who had died in Somalia the previous December, reportedly from an exploding anti-tank mine. Local obituaries did not print notices of his death, and the only thing the Pentagon had to say was that Friedman, a civilian employee of the U.S. government, died in Somalia during a classified mission. Brigadier General Richard Potter Jr., an old friend of Friedman's and deputy commander of the Army Special Operations Command, told reporters, "The record will not reflect the many operations he participated in." Friedman's father said, "He was a secret to all of us." Soon those who knew Friedman began to understand the bigger picture about the secret life of the man they thought they knew. Friedman died as he had lived, fast, hard, and discreetly. It turned out that Friedman was a consummate soldier, Special Forces medic in Vietnam, and a survivor of a failed Delta Force rescue mission during the 1979-80 Iran hostage crisis, where 8 of his fellow elite super soldiers died. He had also been among the first to train the Delta Force anti-terrorist unit at the JFK Special Warfare Center in Fort Bragg. As an expert sniper, Friedman instructed the Secret Service on presidential convoy procedures. After retiring in 1990, he began 2 years of special assignments, sometimes disappearing for weeks at a time, into the military underworld of the Delta Force, which included covert assignments in North and Central America, the Middle East, Bosnia, and Africa. The Pentagon refused to answer the elder Friedman's questions about the circumstances surrounding the death of his son. Note: the Buffalo News described the many mourners at his funeral that included bikers, Green Berets, combat veterans, children, generals, spies, and nationals from around the world, including Vietnam and Panama. Some said, one report, looked like they could rip your throat out. The kind of guys who you're afraid to look into their eyes because you know there'd be nothing there. After his death, Friedman's family did learn about previously unknown medals he had earned, including a Bronze Star for Valor in Vietnam, a Purple Heart, and about 20 other medals he never told them about. End note. Friedman, McVeigh told his sister, was the first known casualty of U.S. covert operations in Somalia. Throughout the next 2 years, McVeigh sent his sister news clippings about a number of political corruption scandals, many involving clandestine operations similar to those he said he learned about during the Special Forces tryout. One about the arrest of 2 brothers who attempted to transport 66 pounds of cocaine on an Air Force plane. Others pertained to CIA smuggling of heroin into the U.S. and the explosion of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. McVeigh then made his way to a number of locations of interest, including the headquarters of the militia of Montana, where he was introduced to other visitors, including Aryan Nations members, as a mercenary named Sergeant Mack. He also began making phone calls to other white power movement groups, including a Pennsylvania chapter of the National Alliance. Note: while at the militia of Montana headquarters, McVeigh reportedly bragged to one Aryan Nations member that he knew Tom Robb, leader of a KKK chapter in Arkansas, and indeed McVeigh had filled out an application to become a member of that chapter a few months earlier, around the same time he began calling a Pennsylvania chapter of the National Alliance. End note. Early on his travels in January 1993, while at a gun show in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, he met Roger Moore, a gun dealer who divided his time between Arkansas and southern Florida. McVeigh was selling white power t-shirts and copies of the Turner Diaries, and the two struck up a conversation. No stranger to the extreme right, Moore claimed to have been involved with training anti-Castro Cubans. By the 1970s and 80s, he was a self-made millionaire mainly, he said, by building speedboats for government agencies, including the CIA and other elite clientele. Moore ran with the Iran-Contra crowd, think Ollie North. had numerous international arms dealing associates, and was in tight with civilian military assistants, a group of CIA-backed mercenaries who, during the late 1980s, were involved in the U.S.'s clandestine activities in Nicaragua, and later, at the exact time McVeigh met Moore, were a key group in the FBI's PATCON operation, although whether as targets, assets, or both is unclear. Like McVeigh, Moore employed numerous aliases, but most people knew him as Bob Miller or Bob Anderson. Moore was a familiar face on the gun show circuit, where he promoted his homemade porn distribution enterprise and mail-order firearms business. In the preceding years, Moore himself had been the subject of state and federal investigations on more than one occasion. From 1989 until March 1993, the Arkansas and Oregon State Police, as well as the ATF, FBI, and Department of Defense, would investigate Moore for various infractions, including plans to mail hundreds of pounds of C4 explosives through the mail, sale of government property stolen from military installations, including ammunition, intent to sell explosives and bootlegged porn, origins of which are unknown, and the sale of ammunition, grenades, and flares that he again shipped through the mail. Each time an investigation into Moore's activities was begun, it was just as quickly ended, mainly through the request or inaction of the FBI. Note: in May 1989, by the Arkansas State Police and the ATF for offering to ship 100 pounds of C4 explosives in the mail to a confidential ATF informant. The investigation was dropped as quickly as it had begun. In June 1989, Moore had been arrested in Salt Lake City for theft of government property in a Department of Defense/FBI undercover investigation called Operation Punch-Out, which was looking into theft of equipment from military installations. To do so, undercover agents set up a fake surplus store, and when individuals came in trying to hawk the equipment, they were arrested. Roger Moore was one of the first to show up, offering to provide ammunition, explosives, and bootleg porn videos that he said he got from an underground network. The criminal charges against Moore were dropped in 1991 at the request of the FBI, who cited lack of evidence, and no further investigation into the matter was conducted. In early March 93, the Arkansas and Oregon State Police exchanged information with the FBI about Moore's sale of ammunition, grenades, and flare launchers to a felon, but once again nothing came of it. After the bombing, Moore claimed he was a government informant, although by the looks of it he was much more than that. According to Terry Nichols, Moore, one of the first contacts in McVeigh's network of friends, helped instruct McVeigh on the ins and outs of the gun show circuit, where he would spin the web of contacts needed to carry out the bombing. Either way, Moore and McVeigh became fast friends. They met up again a couple weeks later, and Moore invited McVeigh to stop by his Arkansas ranch sometime. There were already rumors circulating among the Patriot crowd that the federal government was taking extra-legal measures to disarm American citizens, and after April 19, 1993, the rumors would become self-evident fact. This began when, in June 1992, the ATF initiated an investigation of a religious sect in Waco, Texas, the Branch Davidians, who lived communally on a plot of land called Mount Carmel. The leader of the sect, David Koresh, often brought semi-automatic weapons at wholesale prices and then sold them for a profit. Questions arose about the legality of these sales. Although they could have asked to inspect his stock of guns, in the words of a later congressional investigation report, before pursuing traditional avenues of investigation, the ATF instead decided to pursue a military-style raid or dynamic entry on Mount Carmel. A federal magistrate denied the ATF's first request for a warrant on the grounds of insufficient evidence. 3 weeks later, the ATF tried again, this time filing affidavits in support of their request, which included a copious amount of misleading and factually inaccurate statements, substantial, irrelevant, and confusing information, and failed to properly qualify witnesses' testimony. In the affidavit seeking a warrant, and throughout the events that followed, the ATF, and later FBI, would characterize the Davidians within their internal reports and to the media as a dangerous extremist organization and cult. Once the warrant to search the Davidian complex was obtained, the ATF concocted a story about a meth lab operating out of Mount Carmel, a fabrication that, under Operation Alliance, allowed Joint Task Force 6 to provide military assistance for the planned raid. Thus began what the Department of the Treasury would describe as the largest enforcement effort ever mounted by the ATF, and one of the largest in the history of law enforcement. Throughout January and February 1993, the National Guard flew military surveillance aircraft over Mount Carmel, while the Special Forces trained ATF agents in urban combat or mountain techniques. This, of course, caught the attention of the media, and word of the goings-on at Waco spread rapidly throughout Patriot circles. When the ATF finally attempted to serve their search warrant on February 28, 1993, they did so by way of 80 federal agents decked out in full combat gear, camouflage fatigues, Kevlar helmets, flak jackets, and wielding submachine guns, semi-automatic and sniper rifles, and grenades. All of this while military Black Hawk helicopters flew overhead. A firefight broke out between the Davidians and ATF agents, leaving 6 congregants and 4 ATF agents dead. The FBI's hostage rescue team then arrived, beginning a 50-day standoff and stunning display of federal power that included Abrams tanks, as well as, much to McVeigh's dismay, Bradley fighting vehicles, combat engineering vehicles or earth movers, and more than 800 federal and state agents, and additional military personnel. During this time, media broadcasts continuously spread ill-informed and often totally erroneous, dehumanizing characterizations of the Davidian cult, who had been brainwashed by their leader David Koresh, who they said was sexually abusing the sect's children, despite the fact that an earlier investigation found these allegations baseless. Much of the rhetoric and false information cited by the media originated with spokespeople from the Cult Awareness Network, or CAN, a group that had formed in 1971 under a different name as a support group for parents whose children had run off to join non-traditional religious groups. It quickly transformed into a lobbying group and public awareness organization whose primary mission was to combat mind control and brainwashing used by unconventional new religious movements deemed cults. Unfortunately, the term was a dubious and vaguely defined one. When deposed in one of many lawsuits concerning CAN's violation of human and civil rights, CAN Executive Director Cynthia Kisser offered this definition: a cult is an organization can be large or small, size is not the determinant, that has the expressive devotion to a leader, principle, or idea. Note, when asked if the Democratic Party would be considered a cult, Kisser agreed it would. To counter the so-called brainwashing and break the hypnotic trance cult members were under, CAN and other cult-busting groups employed controversial methods including kidnapping individuals and subjecting them to involuntary deprogramming, a process that utilized the exact methods they accused the brainwashers of using, and sometimes were much worse. In their efforts to unbrainwash alleged victims, CAN deprogrammers had been known to beat, drug, and sexually assault non-compliant individuals they had rescued or kidnapped. And some of them made a lot of money doing this. The ATF's original affidavit to obtain the search warrant contained hyperbole very similar to that used by CAN experts, and a number of unfounded accusations and inaccurate claims within it had originated from one of CAN's most notorious deprogrammers, who had deprogrammed a former Davidian. Ranking CAN members acted as consultants to the ATF and FBI during the siege, although to what extent is debated. And CAN spokespeople appeared regularly in the media, spreading what would only later be revealed false but titillating stories about the depravity of the Davidians, and publicly urging the FBI to use lethal force against them. In response to a growing public outcry and criticism about the massive military buildup in Waco, Attorney General Janet Reno and President Bill Clinton capitalized on the moral panic generated by CAN and repeated the unfounded claims and outright lies to the American people. In doing so, they further demonized the Davidians and largely neutralized criticism about all manner of illegalities that had already and were about to occur in Waco. Janet Reno in particular had a history of invoking the safety of children to authorize overreaching operations. Things were not looking good for the Davidians, and religious freedom organizations and civil libertarians on the right and left began expressing their objections to and horror with the methods being used at Waco. Although the FBI made sure the media could not get within miles of Mount Carmel, countless protesters, spectators, and media crews began arriving and got as close as they could. While individuals and groups from all political spectrum rallied on behalf of the Davidians, the national media focused on the most extreme and therefore entertaining voices, notably that of Indianapolis attorney and self-proclaimed acting adjunct general of the organized militia of the United States, Linda Thompson. Thompson proclaimed to as many media outlets as she could that the events at Waco were evidence of the government's declaration of war on non-traditional religions, and put out a rallying cry for patriots to join her at Waco and assemble with long arms, vehicles, including tracked and armored aircraft and any available gear. Note: the fact that Davidians were an interracial sect did not stop some of the more public relations savvy white supremacist spokespeople from making their way to Waco, among them Louis Beam, master propagandist, strategist, and ambassador at large for the Aryan nations. End note. For many, statements such as this only served to reinforce negative stereotypes and escalate the tension brewing at Waco. Some, however, chose to answer the calls to action put out by Thompson and others, including McVeigh, who arrived at Waco 10 days into the standoff. He spent this time there observing, talking to people, and selling Second Amendment bumper stickers. He told a student journalist who interviewed and photographed him that people should pay closer attention to the government and heed any warning signs that it might be overstepping its legitimate role. Note: later, confusion existed among his defense team as to the number of pilgrimages McVeigh made to Waco, as well as their dates and the duration of the visits. McVeigh himself acknowledged that he returned to Mount Carmel about 1 year after the fire there. End note. McVeigh left Waco while the siege was still ongoing and headed to Terry Nichols' house in Michigan, planning to return in a few days with Nichols. On August 19, 1993, hours before they were about to begin their drive to Texas, McVeigh watched live television coverage of a fire that broke out inside the Davidian church, which, when all was said and done, consumed the lives of 76 men, women, and children. In that moment, McVeigh unalterably snapped. His already existing frustrations and outrage now wholly consumed him as he saw the ATF and FBI's use of heavy-handed lethal tactics, while the media justified this by spinning the Davidians into demons. Any number of things about the events at Waco deeply disturbed McVeigh. To begin with, many of the same ATF and FBI agents who had been involved in the Ruby Ridge fiasco less than a year before were also involved at Waco. Although many debated the sequence of events that led to the deaths, nobody debated that for 181 days, authorities subjected the sect to a number of psychological warfare tactics in what they would call a stress escalation program. This included blasting sounds of dying rabbits, Nancy Sinatra's song, "These Boots Were Made for Walkin'," and flooded those inside with bright lights for days on end. Worse still, Bradley vehicles relentlessly circled the compound and eventually charged the building, ramming holes in it, and inserting pyrotechnic tear gas rounds, or CS gas, an act that some said caused the fire that burned and asphyxiated those inside. Perhaps worst of all, during the 6-hour fire, the Bradley vehicles, equipped with plows, demolished the walls of the building and trapped most of the still-alive Davidians inside. As the listless drifter watched the fiery conclusion live on TV, his calling became clear. His attorneys later noted that, while cold and callous towards his own victims, every time he spoke of the deaths of the Davidians, his eyes welled up with tears. Most accounts and theories cite Waco as the primary motive for the bombing in Oklahoma, noting its occurrence on the 2nd anniversary of that tragedy. Linda Thompson, who helped rally the Patriots to Waco, was known for making outrageous statements. Although her documentary, Waco the Big Lie, about the government conspiracy to kill the Davidians was well received among the movement, until more credible ones came out, even her most militant gun-toting comrades viewed her with suspicion, as a possible agent provocateur, government agent, or simply insane. She frequently said things that, at best, could discredit all of them, or worse, could only result in further state repression for everyone. Like the time she tried to rally patriots to come heavily armed to Washington, D.C., storm the Capitol building, place officials under citizen's arrest, and try them for treason. Their skepticism was just fine with Thompson, because Thompson, like William Cooper, viewed many of her camouflage colleagues with as much suspicion as they viewed her, and, like Cooper, made no secret about it, but rather took any chance presented to accuse one or another of her peers of being CIA, FBI, or ATF agents. Thompson, in fact, was a regular guest on Cooper's show. After Waco, Thompson became, at least for the mainstream press, the Joan of Arc of the militia-patriot movement. On April 23, 1995, just days after the bombing, Thompson called the FBI and expressed her belief, often repeated later, that one of the objectives of the bombing was to destroy ATF records relating to the Waco operation. She then told agents about various people she believed were spying on her or trying to discredit her. The FBI report documenting the call noted that the agent Thompson spoke to instructed her to call back when she had facts, not theories, to support her allegations. She then called back a couple hours later to report that Dr. Louis Jolyon Jolly West, the psychiatrist brought in to examine Timothy McVeigh after his arrest, was actually a CIA operative responsible for implanting microchips in Army personnel in an experiment called MKUltra, and had done this to McVeigh during a 20-minute outpatient procedure. Thompson then warned the agent she was speaking with that the FBI must stop West from taking the chip out of McVeigh so that the FBI can probe what the CIA did. 2 days after her call to the FBI, Thompson posted an announcement to a Patriot Network computer bulletin board. She began by declaring, "The FBI just threatened me," and went on to outline an incoherent theory of the bombing and its cover-up involving Japan, the White House, and the FBI. She said that when she called the FBI to report her information, she was told that if she didn't stop her investigations, McVeigh's actions would be blamed on her, and she would find herself becoming a co-defendant. About a week after that, she showed up at the Marion County, Indiana prosecutor's office, armed, seeking to file battery and stalking charges against a local journalist. When told that she did not have enough evidence to do so, Thompson began yelling and screaming about a number of things. The CIA was trying to murder her, she said, because she knew too much about their weapons sales to third-world countries, and those in the government responsible for the Oklahoma bombing were trying to kill her by shooting beams from radio frequency weapons into her head, and that they'd already killed 6 of her friends this way. She was arrested. Archived computer bulletin board discussions posted immediately after the bombing illustrate that at least some of those on the fringe she supposedly represented viewed her OKC-related antics as intentionally misleading distractions, with proto-fascist undertones much like those of William Cooper. Thompson and Bill Cooper are 2 peas in the same pod, said one commentator. Still, while Cooper was depicted as McVeigh's ideological father, Thompson was his guiding light, his paramilitary mother figure. Thompson herself bragged to the National Enquirer about how, "The FBI told me that Timothy McVeigh reveres me." McVeigh appeared to play down his reverence for Thompson, though, describing her to his attorneys as a flake. He had called her once, a few months after the fire at Waco, he added, but she accused him of being in the CIA and refused to speak with him. Whatever he felt about her personally, by all accounts McVeigh had passed out Thompson's Waco documentary with as much vigor as he did the Turner Diaries. So much so that the film was mentioned at his trial to illustrate how the conspiratorial worldview led to just the type of mindset that resulted in the bombing. Unfortunately, the media's eagerness to quote Thompson's reliably bizarre statements had the effect of equating any later questioning of the government's investigation and final narrative of the bombing, or the actions at Waco, to the kind of lunacy floated by Thompson. Perhaps frustrated that the FBI wasn't taking her information seriously, Thompson called the Jones team in June 1995, and during a long rambling monologue, complained about other Patriot figures who were secret Israeli Mossad and NSA agents, corrected the misperception that McVeigh's chip was in his rear end, it was, she said, actually in his nose or behind his ear, and warned them that Jolly West, the CIA contract psychiatrist involved in Nazi experiments, had been visiting McVeigh, perhaps without their or even his knowledge of it. She actually had more information than this, she told them, and wished she could offer it to them, but her phones were bugged, and she'd probably be killed if she shared what she'd uncovered. However, she recommended they speak with William Cooper, who could relay at least some of the information, and gave them his phone number. McVeigh became part of the very conspiracy theory lore said to have infected him. A portion of this lore involved the machinations of Dr. Jolly West, who in certain circles, including Thompson's, was thought of as a demon in the flesh, a true deceiver that employed his forked tongue and crocodile tears to falsely label law-abiding but politically dissenting individuals as dangerous criminals, and the groups they associated with as cults. West was rumored to have been present during the Waco siege itself. While the rumor remains unsubstantiated, it seemed plausible to conspiracy writers who pointed out that the good doctor was, after all, the preeminent dawn of the CIA's psychological warfare program, and had designed the very types of tactics used against the Davidians to try and draw them out, or make them go crazy. Indeed, psyops were a forte of West's, as were a number of other topics relevant to those conducting the Waco operation. West had established his expertise on the topics of cults as early as 1978, and in the years to follow never shied away from an opportunity to call attention to the multiple thousands of cults operating throughout the U.S., into whose foul clutches millions of young people had been lured. At a 1983 Cannes conference, West, a highly valued member of the organization, advanced the idea of developing a medical model, a device or technique, through which the cancer of fake religions could be destroyed. Although how West became the decider of real and fake, I am unaware. By 1993, West had been on a 43-year mission to rid the world of cults, and appeared frequently in the media to offer his learned opinions about the events at Waco. He warned that, like a social bacteria, cults would infect the masses, and openly lamented that Americans' unhealthy obsession with freedom of speech and religion had hampered the ability of law enforcement agencies to eradicate the disease. Note: explained West. A good approach, if you were interested in curing a cancer, is to find a chemical that kills the malignant cells and spares those that are healthy. What would be the effect of a device or technique which, when applied by society to any organization calling itself religious, would have no untoward effect upon bona fide religions, but would be deadly to the fakes? Malignant cells or fake religions wouldn't survive it. Healthy cells or bona fide religions and altruistic organizations would not be harmed. October 28, 1983. Throughout the 1980s, West was often quoted in the media in his capacity as an expert on cults, and was a highly valued member of Cannes, having served on the editorial board of their magazine, Cultic Studies Journal, and a regular keynote speaker at their conferences. In 1986, West was commended by the Toronto Star for helping put the bacterial cultists under a psychological microscope. When West received Cannes' Leo J. Ryan Award in 1989, Cannes described him as an individual who exhibits extraordinary courage, tenacity, and perseverance in the battle against tyranny over the mind of man. A highly ironic accolade. In March 1993, as McVeigh was arriving at Waco, West was named in a lawsuit filed by Scientologist students at UCLA against the school where he taught, charging that since the 1980s, university funds had been wrongfully diverted to finance West's anti-religious activities on behalf of Cannes, and in doing so had helped violate First Amendment rights. Other lawsuits noting West's relationship with Cannes, as well as Cannes' violation of human and civil rights, followed. Cannes was eventually bankrupted as a result of several lawsuits accusing the organization of violating civil and human rights, some noting West's relationship to the organization. In 1986, an estimated 2,500 cults existed in the country that had reportedly lured somewhere between 1 and 3 million Americans, depending on who was counting, most between 18 and 25 years old, into their clutches. The number of deaths at Waco and West's own media presence apparently decreased this number, as, in October 1993, West reduced his estimate to 2,400 active cults in the U.S. According to West and his colleagues, former cult members suffered a number of symptoms including depression, loneliness, sleeplessness, anger, violent outbursts, disorientation, memory loss, hallucinations, nightmares, and sexual dysfunction, all similar to what is now described as PTSD, another area of expertise for West. End note. But, as numerous academics would later conclude, it was the type of rhetoric used by West and his cult-busting Cannes colleagues that aided the FBI and ATF's dehumanizing disinformation campaign against the Davidians, and reinforced the unfortunate perception that the events at Waco had been necessary and the deaths there inevitable. So, when conspiracy theorists allege that Dr. West helped design the psychological torture used against the Davidians, they had some basis for suspecting this, and when they described the federal government's actions as political and religious suppression, they weren't alone, however much the words and actions of people like Linda Thompson made it appear so. In 1995, Conway and Siegelman, often mentioned along with West in a number of post-Waco articles, issued the revised second edition of their book, Snapping. This edition focused mainly on new religious movements, or as they refer to them, cults, and borrowed heavily from and cited Dr. West in their interpretation of the events at Waco, which they said represented a clear case of groupthink, religious brainwashing, and collective snapping. While they were referring to the Davidians, perhaps they could have applied this to the federal authorities as well. Instead of a more probing analysis, they repeated many of the unsubstantiated or wholly fabricated claims made about the Davidians by the media and government, to argue that the dangerous driving forces of groups like the Davidians were located within the information dimension, the domain of beliefs, emotions, ideologies, and other messages passing among people. Through pathologies of communications, the Davidians had spread very powerful and deadly information diseases to many, including Timothy McVeigh, and in doing so had helped instigate widespread collective snapping. Note: what happened at Waco, they argued, had been part of an ongoing process they termed the death spiral, consisting of a plague of armed apocalyptic cults, murderous satanic sects, radical political groups, and paramilitary survivalist sects that seemed to break out repeatedly in violent shootouts and flame-filled cataclysms. Interestingly, another millennial apocalyptic brainwashing cult mentioned in the news articles featuring West, Conway, and Siegelman was the Church Universal and Triumphant, a congregation McVeigh also visited during his travels, as noted in the previous section of this writing. End note. As nobody likes a snapper, and certainly nobody enjoyed the fruits of collective snapping, in the aftermath of Waco, ATF Director John McGaugh announced that federal agencies would be keeping close watch on groups suspected to be cults. If any of these groups had been on edge before, this could not have helped lessen their anxieties. For a number of people both on the left and the right, the events at Waco represented not a growing threat of brainwashing cults, but the willingness of federal authorities to use whatever means necessary to quell dissent and assert their authority, even if it meant murdering American citizens to prove a point. As with Ruby Ridge, the government's actions at Waco proved more paranoid than the paranoid people they killed. Rather than quell so-called anti-government dissent, the deaths at Waco only further mobilized and united the conglomerate of diverse groups that made up the Patriot movement. According to Hammer, known himself to have snapped a time or two, McVeigh told him that as he watched the fire that extinguished the lives of the Davidians on television, he spotted the Major in the background. McVeigh, said Hammer, was sincerely upset about what happened there, and although unsure of why the Major was there, his presence caused McVeigh to reassess his secret mission. He now began to question how the information he provided about so many groups and individuals, including those he had met at Waco, would be used, and wondered what threat they really presented. McVeigh's role in the Major's operation would soon shift from passive intelligence gathering to something else entirely. In the aftermath of Waco, McVeigh was instructed to cull from his widening circle of radical associates in the right-wing underground a team of men who would be willing to take military-type action when the time was right, and while unaware of what this future action might consist of, he did as he was told. No matter the origin or truth of Hammer's account, there is no doubt that McVeigh now intensified his networking efforts, and his rapidly growing cadre of new friends has been well documented by a number of writers, including Ham, Wright, Pritchard, Charles, and others. Note: McVeigh himself added to the list of notable faces he'd met in his travels. During the July 1995 conversation in which McVeigh told his attorneys about having called Linda Thompson, he also spoke of having crossed paths with several visible folks in the Patriot community, often mentioned in news articles as contemporaries and comrades of Thompson, including Bo Gritz, Jack McLam, Jack Kornke, Ray Pratt, and others. End note. Over the next 2 years, he attended over 80 gun shows in 40 different states. Whatever kind of wolf he was, lone, pack, watched, guilty agent, or experimental, McVeigh succeeded in establishing connections with the farthest reaches of the extreme right, including some of the most recognizable faces in the movement, but also many who tended to avoid publicity rather than court it. In all narrative variations, it is at this point that McVeigh could no longer stave off the powerful and mysterious forces that compelled him to enact his violent imaginings. But for some, the question remains, who helps him? After Waco, spring and summer 1993. In late April 1993, while at a gun show in Tulsa, Oklahoma, McVeigh met some of the residents of Elohim City, and after making some small talk, one of them, a German named Andy Strassmeyer, invited him to come out for a visit. During this gun show, McVeigh helped man Roger Moore's booth and hung out with Moore's mistress, Karen Anderson. When the gun show ended, he took Moore up on his invitation to visit the Arkansas Ranch, conveniently located a couple of hours from Elohim City. McVeigh stayed with Moore and Anderson for 2 days. Moore told the FBI that he quickly grew agitated with McVeigh. He was a bad guest who took over the house and ate too much of their food. McVeigh said Moore was antsy, too consumed with anything he happened to be reading about at any given moment. He was hyper about black helicopters and the Turner Diaries, and kept pestering Moore to read the book. Karen Anderson found him to be helpful, though, and he spent a good portion of his time helping her put together M60 kits, which only further agitated Moore. After he overheard Moore and Anderson argue about him, McVeigh left. The next morning, McVeigh made his way to Kingman, Arizona, and maintained a residence there until the end of that summer. He first stayed at the home of Michael Fortier, and in June rented a trailer in the Canyon West Trailer Park. He briefly worked at a security company who assigned him to guard a chemical plant. It is at this time, while in Kingman, that McVeigh began experimenting with methamphetamines and using the alias Tim Tuttle. He opened a P.O. box at the mailroom, a box that, according to the manager there, was also later checked by the militant, Jew-hating, snake-raising methamphetamine chemist turned alien implant expert Stephen Colburn. Not content with simply maintaining communication with old friends, McVeigh busied himself by making new ones. While in Kingman, McVeigh made countless phone calls to militia and white power movement activists around the country, including Linda Thompson, who accused him of being a CIA plant, but more significantly, to individuals associated with the local chapter of the National Alliance. McVeigh called more immediately before or after placing many of these calls. Although it is unknown what they discussed, both McVeigh and Nichols made claims, independent of each other, that it was at this time that Moore began providing explosives to McVeigh. On several occasions he visited a local shooting range with Michael Fortier, signing himself in as Tim Tuttle and Fortier as Mike James each time. When the FBI showed the sign-in sheet to Fortier later, he was perplexed. Fortier, a frequent visitor to the range, said in all the times he had been there he had never signed in, never knew of anyone else signing in, and further had never used the name Mike James in his life, although he would be provided a new identity later as part of the witness protection program. Similar to Sirhan, whose day-long rapid-fire target practice using hollow-point bullets at a gun range attracted the attention of others, more than one individual remembered McVeigh's erratic behavior at the gun club, where he wildly fired hundreds of rounds at random targets with a disturbing vigor. Said one shooter, "Quite frankly, it scared the hell out of me. He pretty much went crazy, emptying on anything, trees, rocks, anything there. He just went ballistic." Note: it does seem strange that Fortier would use a fake name in a small town he had lived in all his life and where his family was well known. McVeigh would have known this, so it seems equally odd that he would assign Fortier a fake identity. This raises the question of whether someone else besides Fortier accompanied McVeigh to the shooting range. Fortier's statements to the FBI about the login sheets and the login sheet are found in the Jones collection. End note. McVeigh used Kingman as a jumping-off point for his gun show activities and other travels, which became more frequent and extensive throughout the latter part of summer and until the early fall of 1993. Increasingly preoccupied by what had happened at Waco, he wrote Steve Hodge a letter venting about the ATF's murder of the Davidians and announcing that the time for playing games is over. He was reportedly spotted at a number of racist enclaves. Although he denied it, one FBI informant claimed that McVeigh attended a KKK rally in Tennessee, during which he hung out with various members of the Aryan Nations, a group which was at the time a major focus of PATCON operations. McVeigh also visited a number of military installations in an attempt to determine how easy it would be to steal weapons and explosives from these locations. This was the very thing that, not so long before, state and federal law enforcement agencies investigated more for, the exact thing McVeigh spoke about to Carl LeBron before setting out on his journey, and the very crime for which PATCON would be initiated. Interestingly, Roger Moore also spent a portion of that summer visiting military bases in an attempt to, according to American Terrorist, search for evidence about the New World Order's buildup of UN troops and equipment at these locations, a rather flimsy reason all things considered. McVeigh now added a new item to his gun show inventory, fuse-lit flare launchers that could be converted into rocket launchers. Moore had designed the launchers, and McVeigh gave customers who bought them Moore's contact information so that they could purchase replacement flares, of which McVeigh and Moore had thousands, just tons of them. In August, the racist Spotlight newspaper carried an advertisement placed by Tim Tuttle, who was selling what has been described as a military-style anti-tank launcher replica, a surplus rocket launcher, or just a rocket launcher. When an Arizona public safety officer showed up at a Phoenix gun show to investigate the rocket launcher Tuttle had advertised, he encountered a man who identified himself as Tim McVeigh, who was selling flare launchers and a bunch of anti-ATF and FBI propaganda. After a brief conversation, the officer concluded McVeigh was not Tuttle. This was a strange determination, given that when the officer asked what the flare launcher could be used for, McVeigh responded that they could be used to shoot down ATF helicopters, and demonstrated to him how to convert them into incendiary flamethrowers. McVeigh's response alarmed the officer enough to report the incident to the ATF and FBI. Fall 1993. Plots carry their own logic. There is a tendency in plots to move toward death. CIA agent and black operator Win Everett, DeLillo, Libra, 1988. In September 1993, McVeigh attended the annual Soldier of Fortune convention in Las Vegas, where he met up with and manned a table for Roger Moore, a regular attendee of the event. The 4-day convention is a paramilitary theme park, widely attended by civilians, but also a hot destination for ex- or current military, including special forces types, as well as police officers and security professionals. Attendees can take part in a variety of combat training seminars, knife fighting, hand-to-hand combat, etc., compete in shooting contests, listen in on lectures about a number of paramilitary and law enforcement-related topics, join a civilian militia, recruit members into their own militia, or just peruse the hundreds of merchant tables hawking guns and survival gear. The convention was also noted as a place where attendees can connect with recruiters looking to enlist mercenaries for missions to third world countries, such as those conducted by Roger Moore's friends in the Civilian Military Assistance, or even with representatives from domestic law enforcement agencies openly seeking to recruit undercover informants. While neglecting to mention that he provided explosives to McVeigh, Roger Moore did tell the FBI that he and McVeigh got into an argument at the convention. McVeigh heard one of Moore's customers use the word patriot, and when the man walked away from Moore's table, McVeigh eagerly ran after him and began talking to him about Waco. Moore said he was concerned because he had noticed that the man was wearing some sort of law enforcement badge under his coat, and feared McVeigh would cause trouble for Moore by making a spectacle of himself. To top it off, after talking to the badged man, McVeigh came back to the table, announced he was going for a lunch break, and then vanished for 2 hours. When he did return, Moore laid into McVeigh for his long absence, and they argued loudly until convention organizers came over to reprimand them, after which Moore told McVeigh he was no longer welcome there. That's the version of the story as told by both Moore and McVeigh. In another version, McVeigh met up with the Major at the SOF convention, and they discussed the information McVeigh had provided thus far. The Major assured McVeigh that he had only been at Waco as an observer, and had no active part in what happened there. McVeigh knew he was lying when, later in the discussion, the Major instructed him to take his team of men, which he should have assembled by now, and prepare to carry out a domestic bombing. The intent of the bombing, which would be blamed on the Patriot, militia, and survivalist movements, was to take the wind out of their anti-government sails. The Major then gave him a large infusion of cash. While the true nature of what happened at the convention may never be known, what is known is that a few weeks later McVeigh began compiling bomb-making materials and continued to do so for the next year. After leaving Las Vegas, McVeigh continued on his travels, making sure to write to Steve Hodge regularly and rant to him about the tyranny of the federal government, and especially about what had happened at Waco. In one, he accused Steve of suffering from a learning disability that prevented him from understanding the concept of liberty and the impending enslavement of mankind. McVeigh, said Hammer, claimed that he was intentionally leaving behind an incriminating paper trail and had been ordered to do so. When Hammer asked why, McVeigh explained, "It had to be known that I hated the government. Even my own family had to believe my cover, otherwise I could have ended up dead before the mission was completed." In a later iteration of Hammer's guilty agent story, not included in the first, McVeigh said that as he roamed the country after the SOF convention, he stopped at Executive Security International School, ESI, headquartered in Grand Junction, Colorado, a training facility that some of his former Gulf War colleagues now associated with. ESI's promotional material describes it as a private school that provides training in executive protection, investigation, and intelligence operations, including anti-terrorism. Part of the privatized counterterrorism and security industry, with many locations throughout Colorado, in 1990 Management Review described ESI as the Harvard of bodyguard schools. For the most part, ESI instructors are ex-members of special forces, as well as former and current FBI, CIA, DEA, Secret Service, and local law enforcement agents. But other instructors have included editors of Soldier of Fortune magazine. One ESI instructor described it as a school for professional paranoids, but then added, "The line between paranoia and awareness is very fine." Note: ESI's founder Bob Duggan explained that during the 1960s he was a Marxist revolutionary mercenary in South America, and Pol Pot's genocidal actions caused him to change his politics, at which point Duggan returned to the U.S., where he taught counterterrorism courses at, among other places, the Army Intelligence School in Arizona, before going on to open his own school, a story that raises a few questions. End note. While it is unknown if McVeigh actually had any type of association with ESI, he could have. According to FBI investigatory reports, as well as internal defense team records, very shortly after leaving Buffalo, McVeigh did travel to Boulder, Colorado, and set up a mailbox to which, for a time, he had his mail forwarded from boxes he'd opened in other states. This puzzled his attorneys, who wondered in an internal memo why he had been in Colorado for any length of time that would warrant his opening a mailbox there. Note: the FBI checked the phone records of a number of locations in Colorado during their investigation, although their checking of phone records throughout the country probably stands as the most thorough aspect of their investigation. End note. Interestingly, ESI is mentioned in James Gibson's book, Warrior Dreams, Violence and Manhood in Post-Vietnam America, as one of a growing number of security training, or mercenary schools, that were popping up in the late 1980s and early 1990s that actively recruited at the annual Soldier of Fortune conventions. In the fall of 1993, McVeigh made his way to the home of Terry Nichols in Michigan, where he stayed until January, during which time he used Michigan, rather than Kingman, as the jumping-off point for his continued travels. He also began having an affair with Terry's wife, Marife, while Terry was at work. Terry's brother James described how during this time McVeigh talked about the possibility that a secret shot he was administered in the Army had caused him to develop Gulf War syndrome. McVeigh, he said, had gone so far as to visit the VA hospital in Saginaw because his bones ached, his teeth hurt, his gums hurt, he had no energy, and was always tired. He also voiced a suspicion that a tracking chip might have been injected in him, but when James suggested he go to the hospital to find out, McVeigh declined, saying it was unlikely they would tell him the truth even if they did find one. James then suggested he see a private doctor, and even made an appointment with one on his behalf, but McVeigh backed off and failed to show up. James said he did not dismiss the idea out of hand because he and Terry had used tracking chips in their turkeys for years. James added, as an aside, and likely unaware of the guilty agent stories he was telling some people, that McVeigh had probably been under surveillance for the last couple years, and most likely his watchers opened a file on him when he went to Waco. Other individuals, including a man in Michigan and one in Kansas, independently spoke to reporters about similar conversations they'd had with McVeigh. One of them, Phil Morosky in Michigan, said McVeigh told him the government planted one of those chips that they have for identifying cattle, sheep, or goats, so the all-seeing eye of the government could keep an eye on him and know where he was. The chip, McVeigh complained, sometimes caused a real sharp pain in his rear. Note: Terry Nichols worked for a rancher in Kansas from March to October 1994. When interviewed by the Jones team, both he and his son recalled McVeigh's tracking chip story, and when I asked the son about this in May 2009, he again confirmed the story. End note. Moore told the FBI that he ran into McVeigh again at a gun show in Knob Creek, Kentucky during the first week of October, but that McVeigh mainly spoke with Karen Anderson. On October 11, 1993, McVeigh received a traffic ticket for passing on a double yellow line, about 4 miles from Elohim City. In the Pack of Wolves, Washed Wolves, and Guilty Agent stories, McVeigh visited Elohim City and thus began the plot to bomb the Murrah Federal Building. The conspiracy involved McVeigh and a number of people associated with the White Power movement. McVeigh's Pack of Wolves would consist of, among others, Stephen Colburn, Michael Fortier, and to a lesser extent, Terry Nichols, but also a number of full-time and on-again, off-again residents of Elohim City, such as Andreas Strassmeyer, and, most notably, a group of racist bank robbers who called themselves the Aryan Republican Army. While the rudimentary details of the plot would have been discussed at the October 1993 planning session, it was further developed during subsequent meetings. They would act within small isolated cells, each with a different purpose: funding, gathering material, bomb-making, delivery, etc. Throughout the lead-up to the bombing, the conspirators used fake identification and referred to each other only by aliases. As they gathered the necessary materials and bomb-making components, false paper trails were laid in order to confuse investigators later. Certain conspirators even acted as decoys or doubles for others, including McVeigh. On the day of the bombing, the conspirators employed disguises and decoy rider trucks, thereby confusing eyewitnesses. Funding for the bombing would come, in part, from bank robberies, some of which McVeigh would participate in. Mark Ham overlaid McVeigh's movements throughout the country from this time forward with those of the ARA bank robbers, and found that their locations often coincided. Sounding much like a conspiracy theorist himself, Ham said, "So many random coincidences have to be statistically impossible. There must have been some larger card at play." A review of Ham's 2002 book noted that, through a process akin to placing layers of the same film animation frame on top of each other, a remarkable series of concurrent and complementary events that fit so snugly together it became hard, if not impossible, to regard them as simple coincidences. To his attorneys and biographers, McVeigh denied ever having been to Elohim City. At the time he received the October 1993 speeding ticket, he said, he and Terry Nichols were simply on their way to a gun show in Indiana. In the months to come, though, he bragged to his sister about his involvement with a group of bank robbers, and at one point even asked her to launder money, telling her it was proceeds from a bank robbery. In the letter, he claimed to be generating funds for the revolution through robbing banks. He had friends who, like him, were at war with the system. Bank robbers weren't criminals, he explained. The banks and the Federal Reserve were the real criminals who controlled people through worthless paper. Bank robbers were more like Robin Hood, and our government the evil king. After his arrest, he told his attorneys that he and Terry Nichols had thrown around the idea of robbing banks, and even cased one bank in an attempt to ascertain the schedule for armored car deliveries, as this was the only time the bank vaults would be opened. In the end, though, they never got around to actually robbing banks. In a taped 3-day-long conversation with his biographers toward the end of his life, he gave contradictory responses when asked about his involvement with bank robberies. In one candid moment very early on in the interview session, he responded by saying that, yes, there had been a bank robbery, but quickly instructed them to leave it at that. Tim refused to offer more information except to say that everything had been planned down to the most minute detail. The things that could not be planned, that's part of the fun. Much later in the 3-day interview, when asked again about the bank robberies, he said there weren't any. Still, an FBI report from May 1995 details their investigation of a California bank robber, whose modus operandi was very similar to that believed to have been used by Subject McVeigh and his associates. At least one of the ARA bank robbers has publicly stated that he had no doubt whatsoever that members of the gang were involved in the bombing. For some reason, though, the FBI destroyed surveillance tapes that captured the ARA bank robberies at a time when legal proceedings and criminal trials related to the robberies were ongoing. The FBI and prosecutors chose not to make a big deal about the bank robbery connection, perhaps because, as was later learned, there was more than one federal informant embedded within the gang. On October 20th, 1993, 8 days after receiving the ticket near Elohim City, McVeigh sent his sister a guilty agent-themed letter, which, while filled with hyperbolic political rants, also encapsulated a story that he would tell in private later, and others would expand on publicly after his arrest. In it, he said he desperately needed someone to understand him, and she was probably the only person who could comprehend/accept what he was about to say. Part of the reason he seemed so secretive was because if he was honest about what he was doing and why, they'd think I was wacko. No one has heard this before, because I realize in the normal world what I have to say sounds very unbelievable and crazy. He then laid out the story of how during the Special Forces tryout he was recruited into an undercover unit to do some work for the government on the domestic as well as international front. The unit would be acting as military consultants, working hand in hand with civilian police agencies to quiet anyone deemed a security risk. They would fund their many covert operations through illegal actions including drug running. His quitting the army and his claims of becoming disillusioned by the Special Forces were only a cover story. While living at home and working at Burns, he found it increasingly difficult to keep his secret and pretend that I didn't know what I knew. Eventually, unable to live with this information bottled up inside of me, and his feelings vacillating between rage, acceptance, and denial, he considered committing suicide, leading to the incident at their grandfather's house. Because of the nature of what he now knew, my life may well have been / may be at risk if he exposed it, which is why he was telling only her. The newspaper clippings he sent her shortly after leaving Buffalo about Lawrence Friedman, the special ops operator killed in Somalia, had been a clue. He begged her not to tell anybody because if she did, it would very honestly, seriously endanger my life. He lamented that, "My whole family thinks I'm mentally deficient, which is part of the game. It's like a great weight has been lifted off my shoulders to finally tell someone. I needed someone to know in case I'm found floating in a river." Later, his attorneys, referring to this particular letter, opined, "If this is a lie, Tim is one good liar." In a letter that followed soon after, he told her he had documentation to support his claims and had additional things he wanted to tell her, but would rather do it in person. In fact, he wrote, "I spend most of my time gathering and amassing evidence. Maybe someday I'll have a chance to show some / all of you. Maybe it would be a mistake to show you all that now anyway. I don't want to fuck up your future." He then informed her that he was on the run, trying to keep my path cool, as, since he already knew too much, someone might come looking for him and try to shut him up. He was establishing a network of friends and now had ears all over the country, so that if someone did come looking for him, he would hear about it through his grapevine and disappear into the underground. He closed the letter by saying that just writing the letter had brought back a lot of memories for him. "It doesn't even seem like it could happen to me, that I've been everywhere I've been, done everything I've done, seen and heard everything I have. I know it must be 10 times harder for you to grasp." Jennifer later told the FBI that for a number of reasons she believed what he was telling her, and his mother said he'd told her a similar story. It is unclear what he was telling her, though. Was he amassing evidence against his network of friends or the government's corruption? Did he know too much about the undercover mission and had now abandoned it, or too much about the evils of the government, or both, or something else entirely? When he said he was expected to fund covert operations through illegal activities, did he really mean fund the bombing through bank robberies? Most have read these letters as fairy tales spun by McVeigh, perhaps in an attempt to impress her. True, partly true, or totally fabricated, it is at this juncture that the guilty agent story breaks off into a new strand, one in which McVeigh rejects his role and, like the A-Team, is hunted by the government and forced to stay on the run. On November 22, 1993, while staying at the home of Terry and Marie Faye Nichols, Timothy McVeigh found their infant son Jason dead, having apparently accidentally suffocated in a plastic bag. He tried to revive the boy and, at the same time, calm Marie Faye, but to no avail. McVeigh said that while all of this was happening, he snapped into combat mode. After failing to resuscitate Jason, he called the police and, in the meantime, placed his lifeless body on, he later realized, the very same spot where he had stood months earlier watching the fires at Waco kill the children inside. When the police arrived, he identified himself as Tim Tuttle, but later said this was accidental, a force of habit. Gwen Strider, the aunt of McVeigh's friend Kevin Nicholas, who became a sort of motherly figure for McVeigh in Michigan, recalled that Jason's death ripped Tim completely apart. His inability to save Jason devastated him. He had loved the baby, eaten with him, played with him, taken care of him, and for a week after the incident had not been himself. Like many people who knew him throughout his life, Gwen said that McVeigh was great with children, and children, including her own, loved him. After the bombing, rumors of foul play arose. McVeigh killed him to keep Terry Nichols in check. James Nichols and McVeigh killed him because the child was racially mixed. As McVeigh recounted the incident in great detail to his biographers a year later, he sometimes slipped into the present tense. Note: to his biographers, McVeigh recounted, "Marie Faye came bursting in my room. I was sleeping in the nude. I jumped up. I could tell just from a dead sleep from living with her for so long, from the tone of her voice penetrating my ear while my mind was sleeping. I could tell it didn't matter if I jumped up naked. There was something too bad going on. So, it was a time to not even worry about the modesty of the fact that this was my friend's wife. I threw on a pair of pants real quick. She had run to the room and taken Jason's body, put it in front of my door, and to tell you the truth, I'm well versed with CPR. I kneeled down, I checked for a pulse on the jugular, I couldn't feel anything. I'm not feeling a pulse, I'm touching cold, clammy skin. I'm starting to get a suspicion that he's been out too long. He's cold. A body maintains heat for a while and he feels like room temperature. I went to the wrist, figuring if I couldn't get it in the neck, I'd try the wrist. Couldn't get it in the wrist, so I decided to check for breathing. First I bent down by his mouth, didn't feel anything on my ear, so I pulled his shirt up, and that's when I knew I was going to watch for the rise and fall of his chest and maybe start CPR. But when I pulled it up, my knuckles touched his ribcage and breastplate, and even that was cold. And I noticed if his core, the core of his body, is cold, he's been out for a few hours. I called 911, and while we waited for them to arrive, my military training kicked in and I was calm. She's freaking out. She's a civilian. She never had the military experience, so she doesn't have control of her emotions. So she's naturally freaking out, and I'm not holding that against her by using that phrase, freaking out. And I laid him on that same spot where I had stood for the Waco fire. In fact, it was right outside the kitchen. Marife is freaking out and screaming over the phone. I instinctively took charge. I tried to block out Marife, but she's screaming. She's now kneeling down, and she's screaming and pulling Jason by the shoulders. I physically picked Marife up and carried her all the way up the steps, cradled in my arms. As I was carrying her up, and I don't know where I got the strength, I was out of shape at that point. End note. The month after Jason's death, McVeigh visited a dentist in Marlette, Michigan, about an hour from Nichols' farm. Soon after, he used the alias Tim Tuttle when he purchased nitromethane, sold as model airplane fuel, at a hobby shop in Marlette. Winter to summer 1994. In January 1994, McVeigh called Roger Moore's ranch in Arkansas to announce that he was passing through town and was hoping to stop by and stay the night. Moore was in Florida at the time, but his girlfriend, Karen Anderson, was there and told him that would be fine. Anderson told the FBI that she let McVeigh sleep in her bedroom, and she slept in a different bedroom. Given McVeigh's history of sleeping with his friends' girlfriends and wives, questions later arose about the actual sleeping arrangements. The red-headed Anderson was a firecracker, just the kind of incendiary men who frequented gun shows might like. McVeigh told Hammer that Anderson had a reputation for sleeping with the young men she met on the gun show circuit, and trapping them in her senior citizen sex web by showing them the bootleg porn she and Moore secretly sold. In Hammer's account, Anderson tried to hire McVeigh and his bank robber friends to kill Moore. McVeigh, as always, claimed he was just passing through Arkansas on the way to a gun show. Nothing unseemly had happened between them, sexual or otherwise. Moore, however, grew jealous of the attention she lavished on him, a circumstance that put further strain on their friendship. Mark Ham suggests that Anderson facilitated communication between McVeigh and other participants of the bombing, pointing out that she knew Elohim City resident Andy Strassmeyer and ARA bank robber Richard Guthrie. Anderson himself testified in court that during this visit she urged McVeigh to contact Stephen Colburn, who, in Ham's estimation, played a crucial role in the Oklahoma bombing conspiracy. Either way, Anderson's assertion that McVeigh called the house shortly before he arrived was curious, because that call, along with other calls Moore and Anderson claimed McVeigh made to their house, was not found on the Darrell Bridges calling card records. This was significant because part of the FBI and prosecutors' justification for dismissing the possibility of additional conspirators was their logically unsound belief that, in Roger Charles's words, the Darrell Bridges phone records could track anything and everything related to the plot. If the calling card records didn't show a call, then McVeigh must not have made it. That the records shed light on the plot is not in question, but the records themselves, which nearly defined the structure of the government's case against McVeigh, did not reveal who made the calls, nor did they preclude the use of alternate methods of communication. In February 1994, McVeigh once more established himself in Kingman, and, except for countless road trips to locations throughout the country, remained there until that summer. In a letter to his sister during this time, he wrote that, "Seeing as it's been more than 2 years since I got out of the Army, things may well be okay now," but told her that if anyone unusual came looking for him, she should contact him at 40 Trailer in Kingman. One is left to wonder what would be okay now, and why would it matter when he got out of the Army? Who was going to come looking for him? Why did he keep warning people about this possibility? Was he delusional? Paranoid? If he was being honest in the letter, then he had abandoned his undercover mission and went rogue, making him a guilty agent in a pack of watched wolves. If that was the case, it seems unlikely that his handlers would have forgiven him for this, even if it had been 2 years. If McVeigh was indeed a guilty agent and had carried out orders up until the day of the bombing, as he would claim to others, including his first attorneys, then this letter was a cover story. He realized he had already told his sister too much, and had to somehow fix the damage by telling her he quit his secret mission, only to, as Hammer claims, continue with it. McVeigh told his biographers that, knowing he was about to go afoul of the law in a big way, he told her these things as a way of trying to preemptively mitigate her inevitable disappointment in him. Note: "Every time I talked to her," said McVeigh, "I knew exactly what I was saying. I had to somehow prepare her to accept that I'm about to run afoul of the law in a big way. I was trying to help her understand her brother. Sometimes I was conveying things directly. Other times I was trying to convey things between the lines. This was my attempt to lessen the blow to her when it eventually came." End note. The problem with this is that he'd been telling variations of the guilty agent story, letting details of it slip out here and there, and warning about the people who'd come looking for him before he had ever left the Buffalo area, somehow preemptively covering his tracks before he even knew why he would need to. During his stay in Kingman throughout early to mid-1994, McVeigh briefly worked at another security company, then with Fortier at a local True Value hardware store, and continued to ply his wares at gun shows. During this time, he became friends with Walter Mac McCarty, a Korean War USMC veteran who earned his living by giving shooting lessons and was known for organizing local gun control protests. McCarty told the Sunday Times of London that McVeigh, whom he knew as Tuttle, seemed like two distinctly different people. In public, he was quiet and polite, and he had this big, easy smile, but other times, especially when talking about politics, he snapped and got real mean and savage. He was one highly strung young man. I don't think I ever saw anyone with such hatred in him. He was bitter about just about everything. I tell you, he was running right on the edge. He had even watched his young friend cry while they watched a video about Waco. He described McVeigh as impressionable and opined that frustrated men like McVeigh make great brainwashing material. In early 1994, McVeigh rented a house in the outlying town of Golden Valley, located just yards from a former member of the Arizona Patriots and current ranking member of the local National Alliance, who said McVeigh attended 2 of their meetings that he knew of. In one strange and unsubstantiated variation of the experimental wolf story, while at a disabled veterans group in Kingman, McVeigh met Mike Gadbaugh, an older Vietnam veteran who he let stay at his Golden Valley house. Gadbaugh, who remained in the house for several years after McVeigh's execution, said that the local VA had used both he and McVeigh as guinea pigs. Note: Gadbaugh claimed that even after McVeigh left the area 6 months later, he continued to stay there on occasion. Records do indicate that a man by this name lived at the same Golden Valley house McVeigh did, but at a different time. End note. McVeigh never mentioned anyone named Gadbaugh, and Fortier testified that McVeigh lived alone in the Golden Valley house. Note: Given that Kingman, Arizona is one of the creepiest places I've ever been to in my life, I would not be overly surprised if there was even a hint of truth in any of the rumors about some of the stranger things to happen there. End note. McVeigh's mother, Mickey, believed that the FBI and others began watching her and her family at this time in anticipation of the bombing. James Rosencrantz said it was during this time that it became obvious to more than one person in the Kingman area, including McVeigh himself, that he was being watched. On more than one occasion, McVeigh had pointed out surveillance vehicles he said were following him. By association, McVeigh's friends and associates, including Rosencrantz and Fortier, had also been under surveillance. Were the watchers related to the people McVeigh said might come looking for him? Maybe Gadbaugh was confused about who he lived with. After all, a number of alternate or double McVeighs emerged in the Kingman area during his extended stays there, and this would happen in many other locations at an increasing frequency in the months to come. Bob Reagan, the man who owned the trailer park where McVeigh lived the summer before, told the New York Times that McVeigh was an ideal tenant. However, in an earlier Times article on April 23, 1995, Reagan was quoted as saying that his former tenant McVeigh acted like an arrogant loner, always wore army fatigues, played loud music, threw beer cans, had a barking dog, and a pregnant girlfriend. Although most quickly dismissed this as a case of mistaken identity and chalked it up to Reagan's confusion, FBI and defense team reports confused the issue. Reagan wasn't the only one who made such claims. A man who worked with McVeigh at State Security Service in the summer of 1993, during the time he lived in Reagan's trailer, told the FBI that McVeigh was fired after about 2 months and added, as an aside, that he was involved with an underage girl. About a year later, in the summer of 1994, McVeigh briefly had another job in Kingman, guarding a warehouse distribution center. His supervisor there told the FBI that although McVeigh quit the job on good terms, he thought McVeigh was a creep, and while he worked there, a rumor was floating around that McVeigh hung out with an underage girl who was between 6 and 8 months pregnant. A co-worker at the Kingman hardware store he worked at told the FBI that McVeigh sometimes attended community bingo games in Golden Valley, and on more than one occasion showed up to bingo night accompanied by another man and a very pregnant female, who seemed to be in some sort of relationship with McVeigh. They made the other players nervous because McVeigh and the other man openly wore their handguns into the bingo hall. A bewildered defense team noted the number of such reports in the Kingman area and mentioned another FBI report they had come across detailing a 16-year-old pregnant girl who lived across the street from Fortier and had been seeing and smoking meth with McVeigh. The defense wondered whether McVeigh was the father of any of these babies. In a private discussion between his sister and mother after the bombing, Mickey asked Jennifer about the rumors of Tim having had a pregnant girlfriend. Jennifer, not knowing the FBI was bugging the room, responded that she didn't believe it because as far as she knew, there never was a girlfriend. Interestingly, the 1994 sightings coincided with one of McVeigh's visits to Las Vegas, during which he applied for a job at Loomis Armored Car Company. On the application, McVeigh disclosed his debts but said they were the fault of a girlfriend who ran up his credit cards. He took the required psychological examination but did not get the job. Adding to the confusion are ATF and FBI reports detailing their numerous conversations with Richard Rogers, who lived in the Kingman area. Rogers claimed he met McVeigh after picking him up hitchhiking about 30 miles outside of Kingman, and over a period about a year and a half, had several sexual encounters with him. While the veracity of this story is unknown, it is interesting that both the FBI and ATF conducted several interviews with Rogers. His lurid stories were humorously fascinating, though, so one can see why. David Paul Hammer, unaware of these reports, claimed McVeigh sometimes expressed attraction to males and had, quote, sexual identity problems. Note: Rogers told the FBI that McVeigh offered him $5 to drive him back into town, but as Rogers felt a little horny at the time, he informed his passenger that he wanted to have casual sex with him. McVeigh was agreeable to this plan, so they checked into a nearby motel, Charles 278. Perhaps because the story was just that interesting, the ATF and FBI kept coming back to take further statements from Rogers, all of which contained strange details, like the time Rogers discussed his and McVeigh's sexual relationship with Rick Corvette, whoever that is. In perhaps one of the strangest law enforcement reports ever written, or at least that I've ever seen, the ATF noted that according to Rogers, McVeigh liked to suck nice dick and suck nice balls. Sick. All caps. Jones Collection. Beyond the name of individuals, which are usually completely capitalized in law enforcement reports, the only other words to appear in all capital letters in this report are dick and balls. I personally refer to this as the Dick and Balls Report. Rogers' reports are found in the Jones Collection. End note. Given all the confusion over which McVeigh was which, even among people he saw on a daily basis, it would seem he had a number of identity problems beyond those of a sexual nature. Pregnant girlfriend, gay lover, or no, or maybe because of them, McVeigh quit his job and left the Kingman area and continued his extraordinary itinerant lifestyle and barely stopped moving, frantically crisscrossing the country in his car, and paid for everything in cash. His friends, family, and former co-workers had no idea where he was, and could only get in touch with him through his Kingman mailbox, the one Stephen Colburn was about to start using with McVeigh's authorization. Note: in the letters between McVeigh and Steve Hodge throughout the summer of 1994, the two old friends discussed or debated a number of conspiracy theories, with Steve always arguing against the ones McVeigh floated. "Do me a favor," Steve wrote. "Perhaps in your next letter you could let me in on what you've been up to for the last year and a half. I mean, I've heard loads about your views on politics, but it seems to me you must have covered some ground. Where have you been, and what have you done? What have you seen in the last year?" Steve expressed his belief that the two remained friends and that their friendship still meant something to Tim, because Steve himself would never turn his back on a friend. He continued, saying if anyone else said the things that Tim did, Steve would think they were crazy, but because Steve valued Tim, he listened to his conspiracy theories, but did not know what to make of the information. Steve closed the letter by asking Tim not to stop writing, because he, Steve, would be greatly upset if he did so. End note. Two letters McVeigh wrote his sister during this period displayed a return address in Kingman, Arizona, but the postmarks revealed he had mailed them from Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Nichols lived in Vegas at the time, and implant aficionado Colburn worked in Los Angeles until his arrest that summer, after which he became a fugitive and lived in mine shafts not too far from Kingman. It was, in fact, during this same period that Moore told Colburn about Tuttle, the former Special Forces guy he knew, who had been overtrained and now led a bunch of mean motherfuckers out in the desert, with whom Colburn would almost cross paths near Area 51. At the time of Colburn's July 1994 arrest, police found a receipt for a storage shed rental in Golden Valley, where McVeigh still lived. Maybe Colburn crossed paths with one of the other McVeigh/Tuttle characters running around the desert. And maybe there was something in the water because McVeigh himself soon began renting storage spaces in various locations, including one in Golden Valley where he kept ammonium nitrate, one of a few incriminating storage sheds he said had not been discovered. Mark Ham, among others, argued that Colburn, who Ham said made the meth 40er McVeigh and friends smoked, was mastermind behind the actual construction of the bomb, that he was assisted by another man who lived with him in the meth lab trailer, and that there was likely another unidentified man involved in the cell, a phantom bomb builder. Hammer wrote that during one of McVeigh's trips to Las Vegas, the Major introduced him to a man he referred to only as Poindexter, but who the Major said would help with the construction of the bomb. Poindexter came to an unfortunate end the night before the bombing, though, having been murdered and thrown in the back of the Ryder truck. More on that later. Unknown to Hammer, Jim Rosencrantz told the FBI that in the summer of 1994 he saw McVeigh spending time with a clean-cut man with glasses, 35 to 40 years old, whose name he said he didn't know and who he never saw before or after that brief time, but who he described as a geek and a Poindexter. As Rosencrantz knew Colburn, he and Poindexter were not the same person, although Poindexter could have been Nichols or possibly Ham's phantom bomb maker. In fact, from here on out, McVeigh, if he wasn't being confused with other people who happened to have the same name, job, friends, and interests, he was being seen with other people who nobody could quite identify later, collectively named the John Does. In August 1994, McVeigh attended a motorcycle rally in Sturgis, South Dakota, where he wore what prosecutors later called a disguise, which consisted of a bandana, arguably the least effective disguise ever conceived of. McVeigh must not have thought so, though, because he continued to wear his biker disguise, including at a racing track in Texas where he purchased ammonium nitrate. Interestingly, around this time, PatCon operative Bob Matthews was instructed by his FBI handlers to attend a paramilitary training camp in San Saba, Texas. Highly redacted FBI PATCON reports from 1991 describe the camp as a 160-acre ranch run by the Texas Light Militia, or TLM, a group known to be stockpiling weapons and explosives, specifically stolen military-grade C4. The FBI had several high-level undercover informants and agents in TLM who reported on the group's plans to train people in the use of weapons and explosives for the purpose of using force against the U.S. government at a future time. TLM was closely aligned with other problematic organizations, including Aryan Nations, the KKK, and Civilian Material Assistance, the latter closely associated with Roger Moore, and members of those groups attended TLM's monthly training sessions. When Matthews attended the TLM training camp in 1994, he saw Timothy McVeigh and Elohim City resident and illegal alien Andy Strassmeyer associated with the TLM since he arrived in the U.S. During this session, attendees received instruction on how to convert Marine Corps-issue flare guns into grenade launchers. Immediately after the bombing, Matthews contacted his handler, Don Jarrett, to tell him he recognized McVeigh as the man he saw at the camp with Andy the German. Jarrett, however, informed Matthews that this was old news, that McVeigh had associated with other similar groups, and that undercover FBI assets other than Matthews had been monitoring McVeigh in the run-up to the bombing. While he wasn't interested in McVeigh's appearance at the Texas camp, Jarrett did ask Matthews if he had ever seen McVeigh in Arizona, as Matthews had infiltrated groups there as well. Matthews had not. The FBI's harassment of Matthews and their attempt to prevent him from testifying about this and other incidents is currently the subject of a Supreme Court-appointed investigation into the FBI's overall effort to silence key witnesses and withhold information about the bombing. Information provided by Joe Hurley, an informant working for first the Secret Service and then the FBI, ATF, and Missouri State Highway Patrol, led to the arrest of Wyatt Dwayne Wagoner in September 1994. Wagoner, ultimately convicted on 6 explosives and weapons violations, had planned to blow up a courthouse using an ANFO truck bomb and a rocket launcher, and had been involved in bank robberies in order to fund his plan. After the OKC bombing, Hurley, like Matthews and others, said he met McVeigh at a paramilitary training camp attended by radical right-wing mercenaries willing to carry out acts of terror for the right price. September 1994. According to the federal indictment issued him, the conspiracy to bomb the Murrah building began on September 13, 1994, and involved McVeigh, Nichols, and the mysterious others unknown. Interestingly, McVeigh registered at the El Siesta Motel located just minutes from the remote Elohim City on this same day. Roger Moore said, although he and McVeigh continued to communicate after the robbery, the last time they saw each other in person was the previous spring, when McVeigh stopped by his Arkansas ranch. McVeigh, he said, had become noticeably more paranoid. He slept by the windows so he'd know if anybody was approaching the house, and kept handguns under his pillow. He kept rapid-firing his automatic pistol in the driveway and harping on Waco. McVeigh left a couple days later, although Moore wasn't sure why, as there had been no altercation between them. That's what Moore told the FBI. McVeigh said he stopped by in an attempt to patch things up with Moore, but left after only one day because Moore suddenly accused him of stealing his flare launcher design. McVeigh said he sold about 10 of the rocket launchers based on Moore's design, but thought it would be okay since by doing so he was helping Moore sell the replacement flares. Neither would admit to seeing the other at any point after that, although through slips of the tongue, McVeigh's defense team and later others learned that they had. During a conversation, defense investigator Richard Reyna informed McVeigh that Moore would likely testify against him in court. McVeigh said he didn't think that would happen because Moore would never dare. When Reyna told McVeigh to wake up and smell the coffee, McVeigh became visibly angry. If Moore ever decided to testify against him, said McVeigh, there was enough evidence available to sink Roger Moore. He then explained to Reyna that on several occasions, including in August and September 1994, Moore sold him kinestics, one of the components used in the truck bomb. In fact, said McVeigh, Moore sold kinestics and many other things he wasn't supposed to, but not to just anybody. If the FBI had ever bothered to search Moore's house, they would have found not only more weapons than were found at the Davidian compound, but cases of explosives as well. In a conversation with his biographers after his conviction, McVeigh said that while he was unsure of how much he should talk about Moore, there was a lot more to Moore than people knew. He explained to them that if Moore's house had ever been searched, Moore would have been arrested on the spot because he sold an aluminum powder used to boost ammonium nitrate, and the chemical traces of it would have been all over his fucking house, which would have matched those found on McVeigh after his arrest. Not only that, McVeigh continued, Moore provided him with blasting caps and cannon fuse, also components of the OKC bomb. But again, it had never become an issue in the investigation or in his criminal trial. Note: McVeigh told his biographers that Moore, Anderson, and another guy used to make their own exploding top bullets with the powder, and Moore had the chemicals all over his fucking house, and the traces would have matched those found on him after his arrest. Roger Charles provides a detailed account of Moore's links to components used to make the OKC bomb. End note. Years later, in 2005, Nichols told the FBI where they could find a box of explosives that he had hidden prior to the bombing. He said that the box would have a shipping label and the name Robert Miller, Moore's alias, on it, and Moore's fingerprints would be all over the box. Sure enough, the FBI found the box of explosives right where he said it would be, but for some reason they didn't attempt to match the fingerprints found on the box for another 3 years, by which time the results were found to be inconclusive. Even if McVeigh and Nichols were just attempting to shift blame from themselves to Moore, their statements would fail to explain other episodes in Moore's life. In 1989, a confidential informant had told the ATF that Robert Miller in Arkansas offered to mail him 100 pounds of C4 explosives. The telephone number and address provided by the informant traced back to Roger Moore and Karen Anderson. While Robert Miller was a known alias of Moore, when the ATF contacted the Arkansas State Police Intelligence Unit and gave them this information, they were told that it was just a case of mistaken identity, and the ATF's investigation of Moore was quickly dropped. Other subsequent investigations involving weapons and explosives and Roger Moore were also dropped. Moore must have forgotten about the explosives he gave and sold McVeigh, as well as a number of other things in his life, because he told the FBI that he never sold anything that would have brought the attention of the ATF and had even stopped selling guns because of difficulties raised by the Brady Bill. Another thing Roger Moore forgot was that according to gun show records, he and McVeigh were both at the 1994 Soldier of Fortune convention that ran from September 15 to 18, and McVeigh was working Moore's table registration there. Note: on December 26, 1995, the FBI interviewed Dolores Grachowski, the owner of the Valley Motel in Las Vegas. She told them that Roger Moore usually stayed with them during the annual Soldier of Fortune conventions. She said that Moore sometimes registered under his wife's name, Carol Moore. Moore had registered in his own name from September 15, 1994 until September 18, 1994, listing his home address in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Grachowski said that during the 1994 SOF convention, she received a call asking to be connected to Bob Miller in Moore's room. When her daughter asked Moore why he was getting calls under a different name, he said it was for business reasons. She did not, however, have phone records for the calls. McVeigh told his attorneys that he was at the 1994 SOF convention and described it to them. He was also seen there by Johnny Bangirder. End note. Also in attendance were a number of White Power spokespeople whom McVeigh attempted to call in the days leading up to the bombing, including Kirk Lyons and Dave Holloway, both closely associated with Elohim City and suspected German operative Andy Strassmeir, both spokespeople for Cause, whose offices, like Elohim City, McVeigh would call in the days before the bombing. Also in attendance at the 1994 SOF convention was Utah skinhead leader Johnny Bangirder. While standing around a row of tables packed with militia and White Power keepsakes, Bangirder had the unfortunate privilege of meeting an ATF informant from Las Vegas named John Brenner, who was congregated near Moore's table. Bangirder recalled that Moore, using his alias Bob Miller, wanted to give us, not sell us, but give us, a safety flare converted into a shoulder-fired missile launcher. If you just glanced at it, it kind of looked like a toy, but it was supposed to be able to divert heat-seeking missiles and thwart infrared searches. We accepted the launcher, and at the same time, Brenner tried to give us another type of fake rocket launcher, which was supposed to launch grenades. They were very cheap-looking, and you could tell those were bullshit, so I declined that offer. Not long after that, Brenner was showing up at Bangirder's house trying to get him to take part in a number of plots, including trafficking illegal firearms and stolen military hardware, specifically night vision goggles and C4 explosives, killing federal judges, and a bombing plot using, you might have guessed, an ANFO-loaded Ryder truck, all defining features of the PACON operations. Bangirder, who during his time in Aryan Nations had learned the ropes of a setup and the signs of a sting, was suspicious of Brenner and rebuffed his efforts, written about extensively in my next book, Redacted. Brenner was persistent, though, and kept trying until one day he suddenly disappeared. Imagine Bangirder's surprise, or lack thereof, when Brenner appeared in a series of news articles for his involvement in an ATF sting operation run out of a Las Vegas gun shop. Brenner had gotten caught up in a sting operation very similar to the one Roger Moore was involved with in the late 1980s. It was also similar to, and running concurrent with, a PATCON operation that involved a gun store in Phoenix named, no joke, Lone Wolf Guns, which sold automatic weapons to right-wing extremists and outlaw biker gangs. More recently, the curiously named gun shop was implicated in the Fast and Furious scandal. Years after he disappeared, Brenner would write Bangirder and ask his forgiveness, admitting that he himself had been busted on a weapons charge and subsequently induced to entrap other people in exchange for leniency. During late 1994 and early 1995, though, Brenner was still busy trying to entrap Johnny Bangirder. October-November 1994. On November 1st, 1994, McVeigh asked Terry Nichols to rob Roger Moore, saying that, as Moore and Nichols didn't know each other, Moore wouldn't suspect Nichols. He assured Nichols that it would be easy, and Moore would give him absolutely no trouble at all. Note: Roger Charles, along with summaries of the Moore robbery investigation prepared by Nichols' defense team, go out into great detail about the events surrounding the alleged robbery. End note. Nichols could keep most of the cash, and the only thing McVeigh wanted were the guns. Nichols said when he declined the proposal, McVeigh threatened his family, and he relented. Now that it was agreed, McVeigh told him exactly when and what to do. Nichols was to rob Moore on November 5th, a day Karen Anderson would be out of town and Moore would be alone, although how McVeigh knew this is unclear. McVeigh further instructed Nichols not to take anything that belonged to Karen Anderson. He gave very detailed instructions as to where everything Nichols should take would be found. Included were a number of unregistered guns with no serial numbers. McVeigh told Fortier that the objective of robbing Moore was to obtain a list of names he kept of people in the movement, because Moore had threatened that if he ever ran afoul of the law and needed a get-out-of-jail-free card, he would hand over the names to the feds. Meanwhile, on November 4th, 1994, Stephen Colburn mailed a resignation letter to his employers at the California DNA lab from Texarkana, Arkansas, about 2 hours from Moore's place. Karen Anderson, who left for Louisiana that same morning, told the FBI that at some point during the drive she mailed a letter for Colburn, who told her it was to his girlfriend, and he didn't want her to know where he was. Colburn's relationship to what happened next, if any, is unknown. The next day, on November 5th, Roger Moore walked out of his house and was robbed blind, at least according to Moore. Everything after that is a bit blurry, or rather Moore's account of what happened tended to change quite a bit, depending on who he was talking to and when. When all was said and done, the robber had taken between $9,000 and $24,000 in cash, precious metals and stones, a key to his safe deposit boxes at banks in Arkansas and Florida, between 66 and 77 guns valued at about $66,000, and other stuff, none of which belonged to Karen Anderson. When the robber left, Moore went to the house of his next-door neighbors Verta and Walt Powell, who, along with their son Lance, immediately thought Moore sounded disingenuous and suspected he was lying about something. They became even more doubtful of his story when, later that afternoon, they learned that Moore had not even called the police to report the robbery because, as Moore explained to them, it had been an attempt by the government to keep him in check. Note: the gist of Moore's story goes like this. As Moore stood in his driveway, he was waylaid by an armed man with a shifting description. The robber bound Moore's wrists with plastic cuffs or duct tape or both and instructed him to go back in the house, warning that another robber was waiting outside and would shoot Moore if he tried to escape. Moore never actually saw the second man. One of the robbers did or did not fire a warning shot in the air. Moore went back in the house, at which point the robber began gathering everything of value except those things that belonged to Karen Anderson. Moore told Verta what happened and asked to use the phone as his phone lines had been cut. Moore called somebody and spoke in hushed tones. Verta had Moore stay with her and asked her husband and son to come home right away. The more Moore told them, the more suspicious the entire situation seemed to them. He seemed to be putting on an act and immediately knew the exact spot where his phone lines had been cut. The Powell's dog, who barked at everything, hadn't made a peep all morning. When they asked why he had not yet reported the robbery to the police, Moore told them that the robbery had been an attempt by the government to shut down a movement he was leading and keep him in check. End note. They eventually convinced a begrudging Moore to call the police. Unfortunately, Moore could not produce serial numbers for the stolen weapons. As a responsible, law-abiding, unlicensed gun dealer, he certainly kept a list, he said, but it had been hidden in a secret compartment in his van that only he and Anderson knew about. When the van was recovered just miles away, wouldn't you know it, the robbers found the compartment and took the list, but for some odd reason had left the $600 in cash that was also stashed there. When the responding sheriff asked him who he thought might have done this, Moore named a few people he suspected, including McVeigh. He also accused the sheriff's office of conspiring with McVeigh to rob him. McVeigh, of course, had a solid alibi, having been at a gun show in Ohio. The neighbors told the sheriff, outside of Moore's earshot, that they thought Moore was making the entire thing up. When the sheriff left, Moore complained to his neighbors that an investigation of the robbery would blow his cover, whatever he meant by that. Moore continued to make claims about his cover being blown to a number of people throughout the next 2 years. The FBI became concerned later that the McVeigh's and Nichols' defense teams would speak with the neighbors about the robbery. Note: according to an investigative memo prepared by the Nichols' defense team later, the FBI was preoccupied with the thought that either of the defense teams would contact and speak with the Powells, as demonstrated in the reports they wrote after speaking with Moore about the robbery. End note. Nobody except the FBI believed Moore's robbery story, including the insurance adjusters. They had a number of reasons for doubting him, beyond the lack of serial numbers for the guns, the large amount of cash and other valuables he said had been taken, and the fact that critical details just didn't make sense, or that he kept changing those details. One adjuster said that Moore's story sounded like a rehearsed script. Moore told at least 3 people who worked for his insurance company that the federal government was involved in the robbery. Note: the one adjuster Moore said that the way the robber behaved suggested Special Forces or Navy SEAL-type training. He told an insurance agent that he could not describe the robber because he never saw him, and also that the robbery had been an inside job and the government had been involved. She recalled that Moore seemed very knowledgeable about the government and the FBI. He even showed her a badge, which he told her shouldn't even be showing her, and asked her not to tell anyone. He told a customer service representative for the insurance company that the federal government was involved and said he didn't want the robbery to attract any publicity. End note. It was only natural that some doubts would arise. Nichols later said that Moore was compliant, just like McVeigh predicted he would be, so much so that during the robbery Nichols wondered if Moore had been in on the plan all along. The cash was not hidden where McVeigh said it would be. It was lying out on Moore's desk. As Nichols was leaving, Moore even told him about a remote location where he should drop Moore's van, that Nichols was stealing. Maybe that was just the kind of nice guy Moore was. The night of the robbery, McVeigh called Fortier, and using Moore's alias, told him Terry did Bob. He warned Fortier that Moore would send private investigators to look for him. When McVeigh saw his sister a couple weeks later, he told her he was upset because somebody was supposed to be murdered but wasn't. Although she didn't know the details, his sister believed him. It is well documented that items belonging to Roger Moore, including his bank box keys and fake ID in the name of his alias Bob Miller, ended up in a storage shed in Las Vegas that Terry Nichols rented, and an ARA storage shed in Ohio. The guns themselves, at least some of them, were given away, sold and planted on people up and down the West Coast in Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and California, and likely a number of other locations as well. As it turned out, a lot of Moore's guns weren't registered at all. According to Moore, this was because he feared that if he declared them all, the boyfriend of some insurance agent might hear about it and try to rob him. It is not difficult to imagine that the real list of stolen property is longer than the one Moore gave the police or his insurance company. Certainly, if he had fake IDs or illegal explosives lying around, he would not have told investigators about it. One also wonders what happened to the underground pornography peddled by Moore and Anderson. Over the years, different theories about the motives and identities of Moore's robbers have been suggested. FBI and prosecutors argued that the sole purpose of the robbery was to fund the bombing. The indictment against Nichols and McVeigh said that they caused the robbery of Roger Moore, although not that they actually committed it, and some have questioned whether Nichols even robbed Moore at all. Others have suggested that members of the ARA, with or without Nichols' assistance, robbed Moore, that Moore was supposed to be killed after the robbery, as directed by Karen Anderson, McVeigh, or both, that the robbery was an insurance scam orchestrated by Moore himself, and or that the robbery never happened at all but was Moore's way to get guns and other materials into the hands of McVeigh and others, without getting his own hands dirty. In 2005, Nichols himself explained that a couple of months after the robbery, McVeigh finally admitted that it had been staged with Moore's cooperation, and the purpose was to shield Moore from being implicated directly or indirectly in the bombing. Note: according to Nichols, McVeigh said that I was chosen to carry out the robbery so that if he was polygraphed, he could truthfully testify that he did not know the robber. He and Moore came up with the plan to stage a robbery so that if any investigation of the bombing tracked back to Moore, Moore could claim he was the victim of a home robbery rather than a supplier of funds and explosives used to carry out the attack. End note. According to an ATF informant who had infiltrated Elohim City, it was in November 1994 that she, along with two other frequent faces there, Andreas Strassmeyer and Dennis Mann, made their first of a few trips to Oklahoma City to scout the Murrah building and determine its desirability as a possible bombing target. In the year leading up to the bombing, and increasingly in the 6 months before, scores of people reported that they had seen McVeigh with unidentified individuals. One of them was Bill Maloney, a realtor in Carthage, Missouri, who called the FBI and told them an intriguing story. Maloney said that on November 2, 1994, 3 days before the Moore robbery and the day after Nichols says McVeigh bullied him into robbing Moore, 3 men came into his office. One of them, Tim, had called the previous month and made an appointment to come discuss a plot of land Maloney was brokering. Tim arrived when he said he would, along with 2 other men who identified themselves as Nichols and Jax. Maloney, who had received naval intelligence training and memory recall, said that as he spoke with Tim he noticed a discolored upper right eye tooth and realized it was a filling. Maloney described all 3 of the men as having a confident military bearing, although the man who called himself Jax seemed to be in charge of the group. During the course of their conversation, the men said things that caused Maloney to become suspicious, so much so that he asked one of them, Jax, to look over a map which Maloney placed in a safe after they left. Maloney later gave the map that had the fingerprints of the mysterious Jax to the FBI. Maloney wasn't delusional. Other employees in the office confirmed that the men had indeed come in, and one of them remembered that they had been driving a car with Arizona license plates. When the FBI took McVeigh's handwriting sample later, agents observed his teeth and saw the same discoloration on the same tooth, exactly as Maloney reported. According to an FBI report dated December 11, 1995, about 8 months after Maloney reported the incident, quote, Dr. Michael G. Gels, psychologist, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, traveled with an FBI agent to Maloney Real Estate for the purpose of interviewing witness Natalie Yards under hypnosis. Yards, a receptionist at Maloney Real Estate, had been in the office the day Tim and friends had shown up. The FBI report details how Gels interviewed Yards and placed her under a hypnotic trance that lasted over an hour. While under Gels' hypnosis, Young provided new information including the color, make, model, and year of the vehicle, as well as a partial Arizona license plate number for the car driven by the trio that visited the office. This rather amazing report raises a couple of questions, one of which is, how many other eyewitnesses were hypnotized during the bombing investigation? And if the hypnosis was able to produce new information relevant to the FBI's investigation, why weren't more of them hypnotized? Gels' background and counterintelligence work, explored in more detail later, makes this story all the more interesting. Note: Gels' career includes over 16 years of counterintelligence work. He was chief psychologist for the NCIS and chair of the Police Psychological Services section of the International Association of Chiefs of Police until his retirement in 2006. After retirement from public service, Gels began a new life as a private security consultant to high-tech multinationals, kind of like the work performed by ESI. Gels is explored later in this chapter. End note. But there's more to the Maloney story. About a week after McVeigh arrived in Kingman in February 1994, so did 2 drifters, 60-year-old Robert Jax and his companion, 35-year-old Gary Land. Land and Jax, using a California driver's license, promptly rented a mailbox at the same small Kingman post office as McVeigh, which they closed that August, the same week McVeigh left town. They probably didn't miss McVeigh much, though, because from November of that year until April 1995, Lands and Jax rented 3 different rooms at or near motels McVeigh often stayed at on dates that coincided with his presence. Note: While Lands and Jacks appeared in news reports briefly, the fact that their arrival and departure from Kingman coincide with McVeigh's was never publicly reported, although the related FBI investigatory reports are found in the Jones collection. End note. If that wasn't enough of a coincidence, early on April 19, 1995, the morning of the Oklahoma City bombing, Land and Jacks registered at a motel in Veneta, Oklahoma, 2 hours northeast of Oklahoma City and 2 hours north of Elohim City, where McVeigh allegedly planned to seek refuge after the bombing. That evening, about 10 hours after McVeigh's arrest in Perry, Lands and Jacks checked out of the Veneta motel and, for reasons unexplained, rented a motel room in Perry, stayed there for only a few hours, checked out, and checked back into their Veneta motel. Maybe the bed was uncomfortable. On May 1st, the FBI put out an all-points bulletin for Gary Allen Land and Robert Jacks, and the next day at 5:30 a.m., a heavily armed FBI tactical squad arrested Jacks and Land at another motel in Carthage, Missouri, an hour from Maloney's office. An FBI spokesperson told reporters that the trail of Mr. Land and Mr. Jacks proved the strongest lead yet in the search for a second suspect and for a wider circle of conspirators they believed to have been responsible for the explosion. Several officials said that they strongly suspect Mr. Land is the John Doe number 2, end quote. Witnesses in Kansas and Oklahoma came forward stating that they had seen McVeigh with them, but both Land and Jacks denied knowing McVeigh or having ever seen him. On May 3rd, 18 hours after their arrest, Lands and Jacks reportedly passed a polygraph examination and the FBI released them. FBI spokespeople then claimed that the two men's uncanny parallel movements to McVeigh's were an unfortunate coincidence. When reporters finally caught up to them, Land was driving a 1981 Thunderbird with Arizona plates, the same car that Yards remembered seeing at Maloney's office while under hypnosis, although this connection was unknown to reporters. Although not widely reported, years before Terry Nichols had owned property in Cassville, Missouri, next door to another property owned by a man named Robert Jacks. Maloney, however, said that the Jacks who traveled around with Land wasn't the same as the one who came into his office. If nothing else, the bombing plot and its investigation may be best described as the most massive case of coincidences and mistaken identities ever. In late November 1994, Ed McVeigh, Tim's grandfather and the only person he ever publicly admitted to loving, died. By the time Bill McVeigh located his elusive son, the funeral was over, but upon receiving the news, he returned home immediately. According to a childhood friend who saw him at this time, Tim had slowly deteriorated and turned into a paranoid person. He got stranger and stranger. He was a troubled person. A friend of the McVeigh family said that his strange political rantings caused them to worry if he had joined a cult. Steve Hodge's mother thought he was going to crack and worried he might be suicidal. Steve shared her concerns. He noticed that McVeigh had now kept a gun with him in the front seat of his car, and, like his mother, thought his old friend was ready to snap. McVeigh told his attorneys and biographers about an eerie and mysterious message he found on his dead grandfather's answering machine. The message, left in a woman's voice, said, "Pick up the phone. This is Jesus Christ. You're coming to see me tomorrow." He said he could never figure out what this meant or who would have left it. Defense mental health expert Lee Norton wrote that when his grandfather died, McVeigh, already suffering from PTSD, reached a final breaking point. Combined with everything else, Ed McVeigh's death left Tim feeling like he had no control and, quote, showed him what he once thought was real and concrete is in fact amorphous and fleeting, end quote. McVeigh stayed in New York for a short time in order to help settle his grandfather's estate. While there, he received calls from a credit card company hounding him about outstanding debt. He told his attorneys that when he finally spoke with a representative, he explained that he was feeling sick from Desert Storm, and because his credit card was issued by the Department of Defense, they eventually stopped bothering him. From his father's house, he placed a 6-hour call to the American Legion in Indianapolis. McVeigh went to visit another friend from high school, Lori, who hadn't heard from him in over 2 years, except when he sent her newspaper clippings about various politicians he told her not to vote for. Lori said that when she saw him, he told her that they had called him and asked him to do some military training. She had no idea who he was talking about, and he didn't elaborate. He did tell her that he would only be gone for a couple weeks, a couple of months at most, and would then be returning home. She never heard from him again. He visited with Steve, this time to say goodbye. They shook hands and McVeigh said, "I hope to see you in the next life." It was the last time they saw each other. Since leaving town nearly 2 years before, McVeigh had occasionally sent letters to CalSpan security guard Carl LeBron discussing Waco and CalSpan's relationship to an undercover operation, and asked him to photocopy classified documents housed at the CalSpan facility about Operation North Star, which LeBron declined to do. While in town in November 1994, he made time to visit LeBron at CalSpan. LeBron asked him why he had stopped by, and McVeigh replied mysteriously, "Targets of opportunity," but offered no further explanation. He railed at LeBron for complaining about conspiracies but doing nothing about them, and then left. He also visited Andrea Augustine. Augustine said that she had the impression that he was living out of his car, and asked him a number of questions about his life, but instead of answering them, quote, he would blow me off, give me an answer to stop asking him, would change the subject, diverted me. At the time I thought he was being silly, end quote. Augustine would not see him again until after his arrest for the OKC bombing. Meanwhile, shortly after he was back on the road, he wrote to her and told her to contact him if she needed someone killed or blown up, a shoulder, refuge, or fertilization from good stock. He cryptically closed the letter by reminding her that people may change superficially but not underneath, remember that. December 1994 to February 1995. Quote, a few agents of the thought police moved always among them, spreading false rumors and marking down and eliminating the few individuals who were judged capable of becoming dangerous. George Orwell, 1984. Late December to early February 1995 saw McVeigh in Ohio, Illinois, Kansas, and Michigan, among other places, transporting explosives and offloading the loot from the Moore affair to various individuals, some of whose identities remain unknown, but who some members of the Jones team suspected were co-conspirators higher up on the food chain than McVeigh, and whom he was trying to protect. Interestingly, Moore and McVeigh remained in close contact after the so-called robbery. They communicated mainly by cryptic letters, the contents of which indicated not only that they still trusted each other and were even on remarkably good terms, but also that Moore was in some way involved with the bombing plot, whose details were now rapidly coming together. Shortly before Christmas, McVeigh made his way back to Michigan. He had been driving across the country with stolen mercury switches and explosive blasting caps and boxes made to look like Christmas presents in the trunk of his car if he got into an accident. Afterwards, although he simply told most people he had been rear-ended, he wrote a letter to Roger Moore and Karen Anderson, telling them that a black sedan, which he believed to be a government vehicle, had tried to run him off the road and caused him to total his car. Authorities later found, yes, mercury switches, blasting caps, and boxes wrapped as Christmas presents in an ARA bank robbery gang safe house in Ohio. The FBI had them destroyed, despite that they were evidence of the bank robberies and possibly the bombing, and criminal trials in both were ongoing. Also found in the safe house was an ID in the name of Roger Moore's alias, Bob Miller, as well as surveillance footage of properties including Roger Moore's, although nothing came of this either. In between gun shows, McVeigh spent a considerable amount of time with Gwen Strider and her family, and after some arguing on her part, joined them for Christmas dinner. He gave her a t-shirt with a Waco slogan on it, a set of used tires, and a waterbed. Strider and her family, including her children, enjoyed McVeigh's company and said he was always smiling. He was like a little kid, excited to be included in their family holiday. During their conversations, it became clear that he was very bitten by the Waco situation, but he wasn't overly negative, just seemed to want people to understand what really happened there. McVeigh, she told the Jones team, believed, not just thought, that when he was receiving his immunizations during the Gulf War, he had been injected with a microchip. He also believed that babies in California, where Colburn lived, were being implanted with microchips as part of some kind of government experiment. Although it seemed strange, it didn't seem overly outrageous, as she herself had seen a news report about pets being implanted with tracking chips. She felt that he probably had a good reason for his beliefs, and if what he said about his own chip wasn't true, perhaps he had somehow brainwashed himself. During this visit, McVeigh told Strider that he would like to live a normal life someday, to get married and have kids, but he just couldn't right now. He had too many obligations. She thought he sounded suicidal and told him this. He responded by denying he had any urge to commit suicide, but added, "When I go, people will know I've been here." It was obvious to her and her entire family how happy he was with them, and everyone urged him to stay, but to no avail. Strider said that as they hugged goodbye, she had a gut feeling she would never see him again, and she was right. It was during this visit in early January 1995 that McVeigh, in a conversation with Terry Nichols, accidentally let it slip during a fit of rage that his high-level handler was none other than Larry Potts, lead FBI agent at Ruby Ridge and the siege at Waco, Texas. Nichols said McVeigh was extremely angry and accused Potts of manipulating him and forcing him to go off script, which Nichols took to mean that the target of the bombing and the date it was to occur had been changed by someone other than McVeigh. Nichols, who knew McVeigh was planning a bombing, had helped him gather materials for it and even helped him build a bomb, although probably not the one that was actually used, and said that McVeigh never told him his specific target. Fortier, though, did know. McVeigh had told him when they drove past it the previous month, the same month that sightings of McVeigh inside the building began. Just before he left Michigan, McVeigh, or someone using his calling card, placed 3 phone calls from the Bay Regional Medical Center. Although Strider never saw him again, about a month or so after he left, McVeigh wrote her a letter and told her about a government supercomputer database that contained the names of suspected subversives and terrorists, ranked in order of threat. He believed his name was in the database. He expected that his health would begin to deteriorate within the next year or two, and felt it was better to burn out than rot away in some nursing home. He wrote his sister a series of letters telling her about his funny health problems and how medical programs are one of the most effective means of control available to a government. The control of medicine and drugs is mandatory. He enclosed several articles about vaccines. He warned her to keep an eye out for private investigators who, he said, were likely to be looking for him, and emphasized they could be anybody, and they don't follow the rules. Be especially careful at bars, etc., where they will try to get you to talk. In another letter, he wrote that they would be watching and recording her, and told her not to send any mail to him because the G-men might come get it out of my box. He signed the letter to his sister, Tim T., the first and the last time he would do so. Jim Rosencrantz told the FBI that when McVeigh made his way back to Kingman that winter, he was very obviously being followed by a government-issue surveillance van whose occupants didn't even attempt to hide what they were doing. Throughout the months of February to April 1995, McVeigh checked in and out of motels in Kingman, where guests and managers remembered he always wore camouflage and seemed to have a steady stream of visitors. The managers of the Bel Art Lodge said he checked in there using his real name on January 31st, 1995, and registered to stay until February 8th. A few days after checking in, 5 men and 1 woman visited him in his room and continued to show up over the course of the week. They were so loud the managers refused to let him extend his stay. Throughout that month, McVeigh, or somebody using Darrell Bridges' calling card, placed phone calls from McVeigh's Kingman motel rooms at an obsessive frequency. On February 17th, 18th, and 19th, calls were placed from his room at the Hilltop Motel in Kingman to the Prescott, Arizona Veterans Medical Center. Note: on February 19, 1995, while McVeigh was staying at the Hilltop, a naval dentist was staying at the room next door, although he later told the FBI he did not interact with either MCV or Nichols, nor did he see them. End note. The following month, this ceaseless barrage of phone calls continued, among them calls to the nearby Kingman VA Medical Center. He met with a mysterious man in a Kingman diner named Ron, whose description matched that of Poindexter. When a waitress there spoke with the defense team, she expressed fear for her life, telling them that the mysterious man was ex-military, who was now part of a 7-man militia group formed by the U.S. Army and trained to assassinate people in Vietnam. McVeigh acknowledged that he knew the waitress and had frequented the diner, but for the life of him could not recall this Ron person. McVeigh appeared at a National Alliance meeting in Bullhead, Arizona, as Chuck, and aroused the suspicions of other attendees. He showed up at another National Alliance meeting in Oklahoma City and appeared in the Murrah building. He made his way to Galveston, Texas to purchase explosives, attended a gun show in Reno, Nevada, won in Iowa as Joe Rivers, and in the last week of February 1995 as Tim Tuttle in St. George, Utah. A man who worked with Michael Fortier told the FBI that in late fall 1994, Fortier had given him a pamphlet from an anti-government group in Utah. In late December, McVeigh told more than one person that he would be teaching a survival class in southern Utah, but when the Jones team asked him about this, he said he made the entire story up and there had never been any class. McVeigh had given Fortier about a third of Roger Moore's guns to sell, but when, in early 1995, he learned that Fortier had not yet gotten rid of them, he insisted Fortier accompany him to some West Coast gun shows, including one in St. George, Utah. Coincidentally, Roger Moore, aka Bob Miller, had connections to a network of international arms merchants and right-wing gun dealers operating throughout the state of Utah. Nationally known neo-Nazi Johnny Bangarter lived in Laverkin, Utah, minutes from St. George. He and his group of Christian identity skinheads, the Army of Israel, held regular survival training sessions in nearby Zion National Park and sometimes hosted guest trainers from other groups, including the Aryan Nations and National Alliance. During late 1994 and early 1995, ATF informant John Brenner was still trying to get Bangerter embroiled in various plots and kept dropping the name Bob Miller, the man Johnny had met at the Soldier of Fortune convention. It was precisely during this time, in December 1994 and January 1995, that Johnny Bangerter's family began receiving a series of strange phone calls from a man who called himself Chuck. Chuck mentioned the names of people in the movement in the Kingman area who Johnny and his family knew, including Dick Kaufman, organizer of the Bullhead City National Alliance. The caller left several messages saying he would be passing through St. George soon and wanted to meet up with Johnny. A family friend who had taken down one of the messages recalled that Chuck sounded upset and stressed out, as if he was under some kind of pressure. In this same period, Kaufman contacted Johnny and suggested he meet with a guy named Tim, and invited Johnny to attend an upcoming National Alliance meeting in Nevada. In the end, though, for various reasons, Johnny never made contact with either Chuck or Tim, nor did he attend the meeting. Timothy McVeigh did attend the meeting, though, accompanied by 2 other men, one of whom turned out to be Michael Fortier, although the identity of the other, older-looking man remains unknown. 2 other attendees, including Richard Kaufman, confirmed their presence. Although the entire meeting was videotaped, the tape has never surfaced. On the weekend of February 25th to 27th, 1995, McVeigh, accompanied by Michael Fortier, registered at the Dixie Palm Motel in St. George, Utah. Over the course of the previous week, Johnny's mother, Mary, received several phone calls from a man named Tim, who said was looking for Johnny. Like Chuck, Tim explained that they had mutual friends in Kingman and that he had a lot of great ideas he wanted to run past Johnny. Each time, Mary told the caller that Johnny wasn't home, but the caller, undeterred, gave Mary the number of the motel he was staying at in St. George, asking that she pass it along to Johnny. She did, but Johnny, who by now was becoming annoyed with the calls and more than a bit suspicious of the caller, instructed his mother that if he called again to tell him that he had gone out of town on a camping trip. He didn't call back. Instead, he showed up at the house that Saturday while Johnny was at work. When Mary heard the knock at the door, she peeked her head out and saw a man who introduced himself as Tim and explained that he was the one who'd been calling the house. When she explained that Johnny wasn't home, Tim asked if he could come inside and wait. Mary apologized and said she had some errands to run, so that wouldn't be possible. Johnny's sister Brenda, who was also at home, described the unexpected visitor as arrogant, rude, and pushy. Note: Mary, a former police sketch artist, vividly recalled the incident. At the time, I felt bad because Tim had been trying to contact Johnny the entire week. Johnny kept pushing him off, though, and I felt bad for him because he seemed so earnest about it. He told me he came all the way out here to meet Johnny, and whatever he had to say to him seemed very important. I never forgot his face. He was kind of skinny and tall. He had a fresh, innocent-looking kid face, and the sun was behind him. It was shining in his hair. Only later, when I saw his face on the news, did I realize it wasn't just by chance he stayed in St. George in the Dixie Palms Motel. It was all about getting involved with Johnny. He really did make a big effort to get a hold of him. The phone bills were in my daughter's name, so how in the heck Tim got our number is beyond me." End note. The next day, Sunday, Johnny, along with several of his friends, attended the St. George Gun Show. While there, he approached the booth of a man selling stickers, t-shirts, and literature. Johnny noticed that the man's baseball cap said, "Is your church ATF approved?" a reference to the incident at Waco. Johnny complimented him on the hat, and they shook hands. At that same moment, a man Johnny knew named Harry Contreys, who had been walking around the show taking pictures, pointed his camera towards them, told them to say cheese, and snapped a picture. Contreys was well known in the Utah area and associated with the old-time arms dealers, a number of whom were well acquainted with Roger Moore/Bob Miller. Johnny said that although it was not the normal practice to take pictures at the show, he didn't think much of it at the time and continued his chat with the man at the booth. Eventually, though, wanting to look at the other tables, Johnny excused himself and the man handed him a business card with the words "Tim Tuttle, Weapons Parts, Kits" printed on it. Only later did Johnny realize that the man he had spoken to was the same man he met at the gun show, and Mary and Brenda realized that McVeigh was the man who had shown up at the house. Although the Contreys picture never surfaced and its whereabouts are unknown, it turned out that McVeigh, as Tuttle, was at the show selling Roger Moore's guns. It is unknown if Fortier, who had accompanied McVeigh to St. George, was at the gun show as well. Given Bangerter's high visibility in the white power movement at the time, his habit of making highly inflammatory statements to the media, and his association with some of the government's most wanted Nazis, it would be easy to think that maybe he had a deeper connection to McVeigh than he was willing to admit. Almost too easy. Sure enough, the story got a lot weirder almost exactly 1 year after McVeigh's appearance in St. George, and nearly 10 months after the bombing. The Jones team had obtained a set of phone records showing that Bangerter had made a number of highly incriminating calls that directly linked him to McVeigh and the bombing. When Jones team investigator Richard Reyna showed up at Bangerter's house and presented him with the incriminating paper trail, including the phone records, Bangerter was baffled and insisted he didn't make any of those calls and that he only met McVeigh that one time, but his name was Tuttle. Stranger still, the FBI had never questioned Bangerter as to whether or not he had ever been in contact with McVeigh. Therefore, when Reyna arrived, Bangerter still had Tuttle's business card and gave it to him. Reyna, of course, did not believe Bangerter and continued his investigation of McVeigh's West Coast connections, all the while being trailed and followed by government agents. Somewhere along the way, the phone records had been leaked to major media outlets, who began reporting on Bangerter and his good friend McVeigh, and the likelihood that Bangerter would be indicted for charges relating to the plot. Bangerter's so-called allies on the fringe right followed suit, seizing and reporting on the story with more unfounded sensational detail than the mainstream media, calling him Bombin' Johnny Bangerter, and because the FBI had not bothered to question him, accused him of being a federal informant and the government's pet Nazi. Eventually, Judge Match, at Reyna's insistence, issued a subpoena allowing Reyna to obtain a copy of Bangerter's phone records directly from the phone company, and much to Reyna's surprise, none of the incriminating calls were listed on them. What's more, the order of calls listed in the real phone records appeared out of order on the bogus ones. It was at this point that both Reyna and Johnny Bangerter realized that someone had gone out of their way to fabricate the records and pass them off to the Jones team and the media. Bangerter recalled, "When Reyna realized the incriminating calls were not in the real phone records, he was scared. I was scared. All of a sudden it was like Godzilla's coming, and that was the feeling we all got, that Godzilla was coming. Reyna said this was some high-level stuff, a matter of national security, and if it got out we would all be in danger and could even end up dead. I will never forget his face. He wasn't acting. He couldn't disguise it or fake it. He couldn't even think. It was like, 'Hey Reyna, you forgot your underwear.' He was so freaked out he was blank. Enough to where if I ever live to 85, however long I live, when I'm lying on my deathbed, when my life is flashing in front of me, his face, when he found out, will be there." Within 24 hours of obtaining the real records that showed I was innocent, Reyna called my house and told me to hurry up and turn on CNN. I did, and there was Janet Reno and FBI Director Louis Freeh stepping on a podium. Reno announced that all further indictments in the bombing were being dropped, that there would be no further indictments and no additional suspects would be pursued. It was the shortest press conference I ever saw. Reyna came right over to our house. He was in utter disbelief. He knew what he thought had happened, and that was that the other indictments were dropped because at least some of them were based on fabricated evidence, and the truth of it was bound to come out, and if that happened, there'd be an uproar. Eventually, the truth about the records did get out when Kevin Flynn wrote about it in the Rocky Mountain News. Flynn really did his homework, and when he fully realized what had happened, he was shocked. Even though there was no uproar, it was very brazen for a reporter in the mainstream press to even suggest a conspiracy related to the bombing, much more so to expose the fact that there had been an effort to try and frame someone like me. But really, I was the easiest person in the world to frame with the kind of rhetoric I spouted all the time and the kinds of statements I made on television. Still, when I was speaking with Flynn about what had happened, it was all very fresh in my mind. I was paranoid and rightfully so. I'd been through so much, so many sting operations, I knew how they worked. I don't know how far he went in his investigation, but when Flynn found out about the records, he was very troubled. Like Reyna, he thought he was talking to a dead man. It was all very eerie." End quote. Flynn's November 1997 article entitled "Who Painted the Phony Trail of Guilt" announced that skinhead leader Johnny Bangerter believed authorities were trying to frame him in the Oklahoma City bombing, and as it turned out, a trail of fabricated evidence, quote, led to Johnny Bangerter's front door, which indicated that indeed, someone had tried to frame him. Still the question of who and why remained. At the time, Bangerter was sure the records were just one in a long line of attempts to set him up that had begun after Ruby Ridge. Flynn quoted Reyna, who said, "I don't blame Johnny for thinking the feds did it. Someone got the actual records. Whoever did this did a good job. It was too authentic." Note: the story of Bangerter's scrape with McVeigh was the subject of several Jones team memos, as well as an article in the Rocky Mountain News. Johnny Bangerter, a major character in my second book, Redacted, has confirmed the story to me, as have other individuals. Parts of the story, those dealing with the Jones team and the fabricated records, were confirmed to me by defense investigator Richard Reyna. As found in the Jones collection, I have a copy of both the fabricated phone records and the real ones Reyna eventually obtained that did not include the incriminating phone calls. End note. In the months to come, the Jones team learned that the government was actively conducting investigations in the St. George area. Investigations they suspected related to Bangerter and his group. They couldn't be sure, though, because despite Judge Match's orders that the feds turn over information about their St. George probe, they refused to do so. In addition, they learned that the FBI had questioned Kaufman about McVeigh's many phone calls, but Kaufman denied ever having spoken to McVeigh, saying that a man named Tuttle had left a message on the National Alliance answering machine, but they had never spoken in person. The FBI was seemingly content with this, despite the fact that Kaufman misrepresented the number of calls and refused their request to take a polygraph. They never asked him about Fortier or about Bangerter's claims that Kaufman had tried to connect him with Tim. The government had never really needed to question Bangerter about anything, because a handful of federal informants had been reporting on his activities for quite some time. Sounding very reminiscent of PACCON operations, as well as the ATF operation involving John Brenner, is an account written by former ATF agent Jay Dobbins in his internet blog. Dobbins explains how, during the 1990s, him and his partners were conducting undercover investigations of extremists in the Los Angeles area. This involved buying machine guns, sawed-off shotguns, homemade nitroglycerin. Eventually, they moved on to more high-profile targets, including Patriot Movement spokesperson Bo Gritz, and befriended all-stars of the movement like Johnny Bangerter. In fact, Dobbins wrote that he and his partner even trained with Bangerter and the members of his Army of Israel. When they got close to the real shot callers, however, they were instructed to disengage the target and end their investigations, an order Dobbins says originated with the White House or CIA. Note: I should note that from 2010 until summer of 2015, Johnny Bangerter had mentioned many of the same people and places noted by Dobbins prior to my finding Dobbins' blog in fall 2015. End note. Meanwhile, the ATF had an active plan to raid Elohim City, primarily based on information provided by an informant who told all manner of violent plots brewing there, one of which was the bombing of a federal building, the Murrah being one potential target she named. In preparation for the raid, the ATF requested the assistance of the INS, as one of the men they planned to arrest was illegal alien Andy Strassmeyer. In later February 1995, Bob Ricks, chief of the Dallas FBI headquarters, called a meeting with the head of the Tulsa ATF office. During the meeting, Ricks revealed that the FBI had at least 6 of their own informants in the mix at Elohim City, and were engaged in other related undercover operations elsewhere that an ATF raid might foil. Therefore, at the FBI's urging, the ATF called off their scheduled raid. The ATF informant in Elohim City, wrote Evans Pritchard, had stepped on a landmine. She and her handlers had unwittingly stumbled on a much bigger sting being conducted by the FBI, which appeared to be a counterintelligence operation approved at the highest levels in Washington, one of the reasons the FBI sought to protect Strassmeyer. March and April 1995. The right understanding of any matter and a misunderstanding of the same matter do not wholly exclude each other. Franz Kafka, The Trial. It was a bright cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. George Orwell, 1984. About 2 weeks after McVeigh appeared at the St. George Gun Show and on Johnny Bangerter's doorstep, he showed up in the Fort Riley, Kansas area with 2 and sometimes 3 unknown men. Scores of witnesses reported these sightings to the FBI immediately after the bombing, one of them a retired Army lieutenant colonel and Special Forces advisor who had unfortunately come down with a brain infection and was unable to offer further information. Another man reported that on March 9, 1995, he boarded a bus in Kansas that was headed to Pueblo, Colorado. He sat down next to a fidgety passenger who called himself Tim McNay, whom he now recognized as Timothy McVeigh. The FBI sought information about a vendor named Tim Tuttle and his registration at a gun show in Colorado on the dates of March 10th to 12th, 1995. In Hammer's guilty agent story, McVeigh received final instructions in explosives at ESI in Colorado during this time, and on March 17th traveled back to Las Vegas to meet with the major who instructed McVeigh to check in on a daily basis until he completed his mission. Since the previous September, Kerry Gagan, an informant for the U.S. Marshals, who regularly traveled from Denver to Las Vegas to Kingman, Arizona, had been providing information to handlers in Denver about an ongoing plot to blow up federal buildings. The Department of Justice issued a letter of immunity for Gagan, who was instructed to maintain his contact with the conspirators and report any developments. On March 17, 1995, Gagan informed his handlers that he had met with some of the conspirators at a motel room in Las Vegas, where they had reviewed drawings of the Murrah building. Based on this and other information, the U.S. Marshals issued a general warning to their regional offices that federal courthouses and government installations may become targets of terrorist attacks. A man using the name Steve Murphy, but listing McVeigh's address, registered as a vendor in a gun show in Prescott, Arizona, to be held on March 18th, but according to the organizer, never showed up. At the end of the month, McVeigh sent his sister his military records for safekeeping, and on March 31st checked into the Imperial Motel in Kingman, where he allegedly stayed until April 12th. According to the Lone Wolf story, McVeigh remained in his room alone, leaving only to get food, although guests at the motel said he had a number of visitors. His defense team noted that while the handwriting on the original registration form at the Imperial resembled McVeigh's, the registration form dated April 7th had very obviously been filled out by someone other than McVeigh. During his stay at the Imperial, McVeigh, or somebody using his calling card, placed a number of calls to the Kaufman's local National Alliance office, a rider rental shop in Lake Havasu, Arizona, to Elohim City, and to the Cause Foundation in North Carolina, an organization catering to legal defense efforts of the racist right. Note: Cause was a legal foundation that catered to defense efforts for those on the extreme racist right. The founder and staff of Cause were deeply connected to Elohim City, the National Alliance, and Aryan nations, and Cause organizers had been keynote speakers at the September 1994 Soldier of Fortune convention, attended by both Moore and McVeigh. End note. According to Hammer, McVeigh spent this time with the mysterious bomb maker Poindexter. On April 6, 1995, U.S. Marshals informant Kerry Gagan called his Denver handlers and relayed that he had just returned from a meeting in Kingman, Arizona, where he learned that the bombing was to occur within the next 2 weeks. It would seem something strange was going on in Kingman. A heavily redacted FBI document, written about 4 months after the bombing, recounts information provided by a man very familiar with the remotest parts of the outlying desert there. The man, who had been out hiking during this time, heard what he thought was a plane going down and saw a plume of smoke. Fearing somebody may have been hurt, the man went towards the plume and eventually saw 2 strange people in the distance with no vehicle, which he said was highly unusual where they were. When he got closer to them, they disappeared, but there were tracks on the ground, and they had obviously hidden in some nearby brush. In retrospect, the man thought maybe he had witnessed a test run for the OKC bombing. Not long after this occurred, he returned to the area and saw a large group of individuals clad in white robes with colored sashes, and a large trailer. He could not understand how they got the trailer so far out into that terrain. The area, he said, was filled with isolationists, survivalists, paramilitary groups, and some religious individuals, all focused on Idaho, probably referring to Aryan nations. The man advised that he had lived there for a long time and was very knowledgeable about these cult groups. He had heard from a source he refused to name that McVeigh had visited a couple of these desert-dwelling paramilitary groups, and that McVeigh had only been a good soldier in the plot, not a general. He believed that, when all is said and done, this area of Arizona would yield the individuals directing McVeigh. Note: the man continued walking around but lost his bearings. He came on an area with several hand-painted signs that said Wayne's Place, and warning to quickly get off Wayne's property. The man said he went back after the bombing, but the signs disappeared. End note. Later, Michael Drosnin, a reporter for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, contacted first the FBI and then the Jones team. He told them that shortly before the bombing, McVeigh had met with a Cuban man at a hideout and compound in the most remote desert areas surrounding Kingman. The man, who Drosnin said had a military bearing, had many Arab connections and used many aliases, sometimes Arab-sounding. He was known as an army officer, sometimes passed himself off as a priest, and had some kind of connection with the Branch Davidians. Drosnin's story also paralleled Kerry Gagan's in some ways. Drosnin told the FBI agents that he really hoped this information didn't come back to haunt the FBI, but felt it was very important they check out the lead before the group disappeared. Note: Drosnin told the FBI he knew the exact location, but he wanted them to accompany him there, as he feared that if he confronted them alone, the people at the compound would run, or worse. End note. Drosnin, trying to secure an interview with McVeigh, told Jones that if he could confront McVeigh with this information, McVeigh would be shocked and would immediately know who and what he was talking about. However, Drosnin advised, based on what he now knew, he did not believe McVeigh knew the man's true identity or who he really was, and would be very interested in this information. Once he knew, McVeigh would not want to protect the man. The story told by Drosnin, who would not reveal the source of his information, was similar in some ways to those told by others, including the previously mentioned man in the desert, and Drosnin's descriptions of the strange Cuban man matched sightings of McVeigh with a darker-skinned man in Kingman. When his attorneys asked McVeigh about this, rather than deny he knew anything about it or call Drosnin crazy, as he normally would have, McVeigh emphatically insisted that his defense team should not deal with Drosnin, saying that he was bad news and obviously has sources and can dig out information. On April 4, 1995, just 2 weeks before the bombing, McVeigh visited a dentist's office in Kingman, but refused to let him take an x-ray, claiming he could not afford it. The dentist filled a cavity for McVeigh, who explained that he planned to apply for a job and the cavity on the front tooth was unsightly. He paid in cash. The visit perplexed his defense team. They wondered why he would have a cavity filled right before the bombing. Was the tooth causing him pain, or did he want to get rid of an identifying mark? Despite the Kingman dentist record and the many Army dentist visits he had made, after his arrest, McVeigh told a prison dentist that in early 1995 he had one cavity filled, but other than that had no dental problems. On April 7th, the flurry of telephone calls made from McVeigh's motel room stopped, and then resumed on April 11th. On those dates, he appeared at the Fortier family dinner in Kingman, Arizona, but also in Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. An overwhelming number of multiple McVeighs, as well as multiple Ryder trucks and John Doe 2s, appeared at critical times and locations throughout the weeks leading to the bombing, and the frequency of such appearances increased as April 19th approached. Witnesses from different areas of the country, and who didn't know each other, reported that the McVeigh they saw made a point of announcing his name, McVeigh, McNay, McVeigh, and told them to remember it because they would hear it again soon. Sightings of McVeigh inside the Murrah building began as early as December 1994, but became more frequent in the weeks immediately prior to April 19, 1995. Numerous McVeighs, sometimes alone and sometimes with other individuals, visited the Murrah Daycare Center, the Veterans Administration and Social Security offices, the mailroom, elevators, snack bar, vending machines, lobby, underground parking lot, and the basement tunnels that run below Oklahoma City, including those directly under the Murrah. Employees described them, alternately, as good-looking, having distinct facial markings, wearing an earring, dressed neatly, dressed sloppily, holding a walkie-talkie, or rummaging through the mail. These McVeighs sometimes smiled, scowled, or spoke. One McVeigh came into the daycare center and told the manager that he and his children had just moved to the area. Instead of questions parents normally ask, McVeigh asked about the security cameras and construction of the building. 3 men came into the Veterans Administration office. One of them explained he was looking for a job and identified himself as Tim McVeigh from upstate New York, even making a point of spelling out his name, like the McNay on the bus to Colorado had. Narrator's note, this is McVeigh like McVey. Still, McVeigh insisted to his attorneys and biographers, "I've never been in the Murrah building in my life." Approximately 2 weeks before the bombing, employees at the federal courthouse in downtown Oklahoma City were advised to be extra vigilant of suspicious people who might be wandering the building, and a number of employees who worked in the federal complex downtown, including at the Murrah, began hearing rumors about bomb threats. Although the FBI would deny it, Harvey Weathers, a deputy chief of the Oklahoma City Fire Department, said that on Friday, April 14, 1995, his office received notice from the FBI that they were to be alert for terrorist activity in the near future, and warned that individuals of interest may enter the city that weekend. On April 14, 1995, Timothy McVeigh checked into the Dreamland Motel in Junction City, Kansas, listing James Nichols' house in Michigan as his permanent address. Guests there recalled McVeigh or someone who closely resembled him, but had tattoos, glasses, an abundance of body hair, and other features depending on who was talking. The owner of the motel, her son, and the guest said the man parked 2 different Ryder trucks there at different times, first a smaller, faded, older-looking one, and then a larger, newer one. On April 15th, Robert Kling placed a delivery order for Chinese food to McVeigh's room at the Dreamland. The delivery driver insisted that the man who answered the door in no way resembled McVeigh, Nichols, or John Doe No. 2 sketches. On April 17th, a man with a pockmarked face rented a Ryder truck from Elliott's Body Shop, just miles away from the Dreamland. The man presented a South Dakota driver's license in the name of Bob Kling, born April 19, 1972. The timestamp on the rental receipt was 4:19 p.m. Depending on who you ask, Kling either did or did not come into the store with another man, later known as John Doe No. 2. Roger Charles wrote, "The prosecution could never prove that McVeigh rented the Ryder truck in person, or that he or a surrogate had done so alone." Note, a significant number of McVeigh doppelgangers roaming the country had acne or pockmarked faces, as did the one who rented the Ryder at Elliott's and a few the morning of the bombing in Oklahoma City. End note. In fact, during his trial, prosecutors could not conclusively place the ambiguously elusive bomber at Elliott's at all. At around 5 a.m. on April 18, 1995, McVeigh left the Dreamland Motel, driving the second of the 2 Ryders he had parked there during his stay. McVeigh, most times, claimed that he and Nichols built the truck bomb in Kansas that day, after which he alone drove the bomb-laden Ryder from Kansas to Oklahoma. At some point after crossing the state line, he pulled off the road and parked the Ryder in a small gravel lot, near but not at a motel, where he remained until early the next morning, at which point he headed to Oklahoma City to deliver death to those inside the Murrah. For the first time in a long time, though, he had failed to leave even a shred of paper in the paper trail he had so carefully laid throughout the previous 2 years. Witnesses saw McVeigh, a Ryder truck, and 2 other men at a restaurant in Perry, Oklahoma, around 7:30 p.m., then at a McDonald's in Oklahoma City with an unknown number of people at an unknown time, then with 1 other man at a convenience store in Oklahoma City around 9:30 p.m., and at the same store around midnight, now accompanied by a lone hooker, more on that later. When his defense team asked McVeigh where the truck was during the missing time the night before the bombing, he responded by saying maybe it was in a government warehouse being loaded with explosives. Among the things in his possession at the time of his arrest were handwritten directions to a storage warehouse in Oklahoma City. In Hammer's story, McVeigh, Poindexter, and ARA bank robber Richard Guthrie completed the real bomb around 9 p.m. on April 18th, after which they dropped Guthrie and the fake truck bomb off at a motel near Oklahoma City. McVeigh and Poindexter made their way to a warehouse in Oklahoma City, where they met with the Major and Roberto, the man who had tested McVeigh on his knowledge of right-wing rhetoric nearly 2 years before. The Major and Roberto killed Poindexter and dumped his body in the back of the Ryder truck. An ATF spokesperson told a group of reporters that there had been an ongoing sensitive sting operation, the nature of which he left undefined, and as part of that, the Murrah building was under surveillance throughout the night of April 18th, but the stakeout was discontinued at around 6 a.m. on the morning of April 19th. He later retracted his statement, but that really didn't matter because even before he made it, several eyewitnesses reported that they saw bomb disposal units near the Murrah building and federal courthouse, and members of the Oklahoma City bomb squad confirmed they searched the courthouse for bombs that morning. The surveillance teams and bomb disposal units weren't the only early birds on the morning of April 19th. Starting around 7 a.m., multiple incarnations of McVeigh began appearing at different locations throughout Oklahoma City, driving very different vehicles, all of them accompanied by various unidentified companions. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, no eyewitness who saw McVeigh that morning was called to testify in court, and therefore, as the security footage from all of the cameras around the Murrah had gone missing, McVeigh was never conclusively placed at the scene at all. At 8:32 a.m. CST, Oklahoma time, the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. received a strange phone call from a man who refused to give his name. The caller said that the federal building in Oklahoma City had just been bombed. He knew, he said, because he was standing across the street as they spoke. A half hour later, at 9:02 a.m., that deadly explosion ripped through the Murrah building. Immediately after, many McVeighs, accompanied by the various unidentified companions, were seen speeding off in equally various vehicles, except for one McVeigh variant, who a few people saw standing not too far from the blast site, calmly watching the commotion and horror. One peculiar McVeigh with a pockmarked face and stained teeth was seen standing around talking to two other people about 4 blocks from the Murrah. A man who walked by them said the McVeigh figure turned to his companions and coldly remarked, "Shit happens, doesn't it?" About 90 minutes after the bomb exploded in OKC, and about 60 miles north of there, Timothy James McVeigh was pulled over for driving without a rear license plate. He was arrested for driving an unregistered vehicle and carrying an unregistered concealed pistol. For some reason, the name on the booking card at the local jail listed him as Bruce James McVeigh. About 10 hours later, Lance and Jax, the strange drifters who seemed to follow McVeigh, left their motel room near Elohim City and checked in a motel in Perry, but left after only a couple hours. Prior to his being named a suspect in the bombing, as McVeigh sat in the Perry jail, Roger Moore contacted at least 2 bail bond companies in an attempt to arrange bail for him. Stephen Jones told terrorism expert Stephen Sloan that McVeigh's arrest in Perry had actually been detrimental to the federal investigation of the bombing because there were indications that the FBI had a lead on Tim the day of the bombing, or perhaps the next day, had already tracked him to Perry, and they wanted to wait until Tim bonded out to follow him and see where he went. At the last minute, however, the ATF tracked McVeigh to the Perry jail, which really screwed things up for the FBI. Referring to his demeanor prior to the FBI's retrieval of him 2 days later, the county prosecutor said McVeigh had an eerie calm. You wouldn't look into his eyes and say there's evil exuding. You just looked into his eyes and said there's nothing. A number of outlets reported that when the FBI finally did come to collect him, McVeigh refused to answer any questions, gave only his name, rank, and serial number, but, at least according to one report, did mention that he had been implanted with a biochip. This article explained that those who inhabited the same world as McVeigh believed that eventually all people would be implanted with tracking microchips, and now McVeigh himself is claiming to be one of the participants or victims of these fantastical control projects. Regardless of what he did or did not say to his captors, after the FBI questioned him in Perry, the U.S. Marshals transported him to Tinker Air Force Base for arraignment. As agents led him to a nearby black helicopter, McVeigh expressed concern for his safety, telling them he feared another Lee Harvey Oswald Jack Ruby incident and requested a bulletproof vest, a luxury the agents declined to grant him. During the televised Perry perp walk, McVeigh's cold blue eyes stared straight ahead, with the 100-mile stare of the lost soldier, his tall, thin frame draped in orange prison clothing. Within days, Irene Fortier, Mike's mother, told reporters McVeigh had lived a double life, and the truth would eventually come out. Terry Nichols' ex-wife, Lana Padilla, told Diane Sawyer that the McVeigh she saw on television during the perp walk was not the same person. There was something off, something unrecognizable about his face. A handful of other people made similar statements. Here we are presented with a problem of multiple McVeighs, a man whose cold demeanor and accused crime transformed him into an unrecognizable monster even in the eyes of those who knew him. Then there were those pesky flesh-and-blood McVeighs who repeatedly appeared at different locations simultaneously, so much so that the detail-minded former Jones team investigator Roger Charles referred to them as McVeigh's surrogates and the McVeigh character. While the FBI briefly conducted an investigation into the use of possible McVeigh lookalikes in the bombing plot, they discontinued this line of inquiry as early as May 10, 1995, even as reports of this type were still forthcoming. The Jones team also looked into this possibility, and occasionally McVeigh himself wondered if someone had impersonated him without his knowing it, which, whether he liked it or not, would have indicated a larger conspiracy. Note: although reports of double McVeighs continued, the FBI, according to their reports, ended its investigation of McVeigh lookalike information on May 16, 1995. McVeigh, who sometimes seemed legitimately baffled by his shadow selves, felt the FBI's decision to stop looking deeper into the doppelgangers illustrated their general willingness to abandon viable avenues of investigation. End note. Pack of Wolves narratives, and some of their Watched Wolves counterparts, suggest that at least some of the doubles were McVeigh's clever masquerading co-conspirators, and given his associates' fondness for disguises, use of decoys, and fake identification, this is also a reasonable proposition up to a point. Lone wolf stories, however, attribute all sightings of McVeigh duplicates and all John Doe 2s to mistaken or overly imaginative eyewitnesses. They insist McVeigh doubles, if they did exist, were simply those he created through his many aliases and bad disguises, and certainly that is also true to a point. From the outset, McVeigh constructed, enacted, and left documentation of a number of shadow selves, an issue explored in the next chapter. All other narratives of the bombing, guilty agent and experimental, purport that McVeigh, like Lee Harvey Oswald, was an ordinary man who became caught up in a complicated web of intrigue and deception. Here, the bombing plot involves any number of individuals watched over, guided, or orchestrated by institutions who possess both the motive and resources to commit the crime, and the ability to set up patsies and scapegoats to take the fall and protect certain individuals after the fact. In a nod to such stories, a 1997 Toronto Star article described Oswald and McVeigh as spiritual brothers, true representatives of a type that emerges every now and then to act out a recurring American nightmare. In fact, Oswald acts as the prototype of McVeigh, and all of the McVeighs to come. Both men echoed earlier and influenced later depictions of the patsy and the sympathetic assassin, and noted McVeigh's resemblance to Don DeLillo's 1988 depiction of a fictionalized Oswald in his book Libra. Like Oswald, McVeigh has the uncanny yet consistent ability to appear in two places at once, sometimes loudly identifying themselves by variations of his name, and then making easily remembered spectacles of themselves. Like Oswald, McVeigh made connections to a number of groups and individuals whom the FBI had placed under systematic surveillance, and was himself under surveillance by any number of intelligence agencies, military, ATF, FBI, private. Like Oswald, McVeigh was in constant contact not only with numerous potential bad guys, but known intelligence assets and agents like Roger Moore, who despite his probable involvement in the plot, walked away, as he had so many times before, unscathed, and just months after the bombing, the FBI systematically dropped him from their inquiry. In addition, while Oswald can be placed near the scene of the crime, no direct evidence exists that he killed JFK. Similarly, no physical evidence and only dubious eyewitness evidence existed that McVeigh rented a Ryder truck, and ultimately, although he was in Oklahoma City the morning of the bombing, nobody can quite say for sure where he was, when, and what exactly he was doing there. In guilty agent stories, McVeigh does misrepresent himself, leading a double life as an undercover operative. His racist rants, odd behavior, and appearances in radical right-wing enclaves were all part of his carefully constructed legend, even if the legend jibed with his authentic self. But alongside of him, working concurrently, likely without his knowledge, are imposters implanted and controlled by shadowy intelligence agencies. Whether the real McVeigh went rogue, went off the reservation, or carried out his orders as directed, it matters little, as there is always another McVeigh ready to fill his shoes. 3 years before the assassination of John F. Kennedy, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover informed the State Department there was a possibility that an impostor was attempting to pass himself off as Lee Harvey Oswald, and thanked them in advance for any information they could provide about him. Note: those who knew Oswald offered highly conflicting accounts of him. He could or could not drive a car. He could not shoot to save his life. He was an excellent sharpshooter. He was a communist, an anti-communist, or an undercover double agent of both factions. Those who have researched Oswald's life painstakingly detail, among other things, his movements throughout the United States and abroad, connections and associations to both extreme right and left-wing revolutionaries and groups whom the FBI had placed under intense surveillance, intelligence agencies' ongoing surveillance of Oswald himself, his communications with the FBI and other intelligence agencies and assets, and the simultaneous sightings of more than one Oswald in different locations. This leads to a number of possibilities, any one of which could have culminated in the assassination of the president in a high-level conspiracy involving many players, including Oswald lookalikes. Similar to those about McVeigh, among the possibilities suggested about Oswald was inducted into a naval intelligence operation in which he adopted the role of disgruntled U.S. soldier and under this guise defected to the Soviet Union. Upon returning to the United States, quickly set about establishing his legend as an extremist and became an FBI informant, and/or was assigned by another agency, CIA, military, etc., to conduct deep cover operations investigating national security threats, which involved infiltrating both the extreme right and left. End note. The FBI of the 1990s sought to avoid these types of mysteries in McVeigh's case, but unlike Oswald, who insisted certain incriminating pictures of him were doctored and faked, once McVeigh became America's face of terrorism, he sought to conform his story to the FBI's. Finally, some have envisioned a plot wherein experimental Wolf McVeigh had been brainwashed or medically manipulated in a manner that induced him to act as an easily tracked guilty agent within a pack of watched wolves, but to compliantly and even enthusiastically accept his role as lone wolf bomber afterwards. Such an amalgamation of narratives was told about Oswald as well, and to one degree or another was told by McVeigh about himself. Note: in 1972, writer Walter Boart hypothesized, as others would about McVeigh, that the many conflicting descriptions of Oswald make sense if he had externally induced multiple personalities. Noting that some Oswalds reportedly could drive and others could not, and likewise some were expert marksmen and could hardly shoot at all, Boert wrote that Oswald might have been an excellent shot in one zombie state, and in another he might have been so blocked that he could not even aim a rifle. In one state he might have had the ability to drive a car, while in another state he might have had a post-hypnotic block so that he could not drive. End note. At times, such stories purport that unseen operators staged the execution of the actual McVeigh, and McVeigh too entertained this possibility. In a sense, the experimental wolf scenario, that consists of and combines all other versions, reconciles the many contradictions between all of the stories, including the multiple McVeighs, into a grand master narrative in which everything fits neatly, much like the lone wolf story, except that experimental wolf stories incorporate rather than ignore and dismiss contradictions. Beyond the problem of multiple McVeighs, there is the issue of the confusing array of companions who surrounded the bomber, and the emergence of several coinciding possible plot trajectories, all of which somehow coalesce in Oklahoma City on the morning of April 19, 1995. In the wake of this confusing trail, the bombing plot itself seems to take on a life of its own, sweeping up into its grasp ever-widening rings of people, many people in different locations with different motives, who participate in seemingly disparate events, possibly related to its culmination. A plot that, in the words of Libra's CIA assassination mastermind Win Everett, carried its own internal logic. Rather than a grand conspiracy, the plot consists of several small random conspiracies, and like DeLillo's Libra, members of the conspiracy are simultaneously inside and outside of the plot, and each conspirator, seeing no further than his own interests, fears or desires for revenge, moves in a private direction. The mystery of solving the crime involves identifying the connection between chance and design, between contingency and conspiracy. Note: plots, remarked Win Everett, carry their own logic. There is a tendency of plots to move toward death, a narrative plot no less than a conspiracy of armed men. End note. In this situation, understandings of conventional history, in this case the lone wolf story, or any other purportedly true version, quote, may be only one possible system, one that has screened out most rings and whose points of intersection are strictly defined by cause and effect. However, if history is conceived instead as an open system or a conglomerate of interacting systems, the opposition between random event and cause and effect sequences would not longer obtain. Certain occurrences would appear to be random only because they are located on rings that are not intersecting at visible points, and certain patterns could emerge outside the bounds of cause and effect. End quote. Philosophical musings aside, what is clear is that the story of the Oklahoma City bombing and Timothy McVeigh is one fraught with multiple irreconcilabilities, multiple unidentified conspirators, multiple people each with multiple aliases, alibis, doubles, decoys, doppelgangers, imposters, lookalikes, and impersonators, even multiple rider trucks. The quandary is exacerbated by the dilemma of unreliable narrators, McVeigh, Nichols, Roger Moore, the FBI, etc., and further compounded by the dismissal, distortion, and systematic destruction of evidence, a good portion of which was credible and beyond reproach. While it seems reasonable to reject any single piece of evidence as aberrant, it is another thing altogether to reject the entire body of contradictions. Admittedly, there seems no way to present all the information or the intricacy of evidential detail and come out with a coherent story that does not wrongly dismiss critical elements of the others. Still, it must be acknowledged that the history of the case, as most people understand it, is problematic, naive, and the continued evocation of the bombing or McVeigh in service of various agendas is irresponsible when it relies on the lone wolf or pack of wolves narratives and ignores wider implications.